welcome back to Turnip's Digest, starting right on time at 8 o'clock a.m. Central. We have a very fun episode planned for today, given the events earlier in the week, particularly on Monday with MLK Junior Day. Um, we're going to be going through a few of his works and a Mises.org article that is provided by the good friend that you can see with me on screen right now. Before we get to introductions, though, I might say if you like what is happening here, there are super chats now. You can also support me at Subscribestar, Google, YouTube, whoever else gets less of the money, I get more of it. It's just going to be better. And then I believe I mentioned that sort of at the end of the month, I would be going through the subscribers there, any messages that have been left. Anyone else will get read out. And that's how that will be. That's how that will be done. Right now I am joined by Repeal the 20th, who some of you may know from Twitter. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing good today. I've finally gotten used to waking up early in the morning, so this isn't too much of a problem for me. But yeah, I'm Repeal the 20th Century. I run a YouTube channel, much like Ryan here, where I do mostly interviews, hoping to branch out into video essays at some point, but do mostly interviews with different scholars on various different topics. My most recent episode was with a George Mason econ professor named Garrett Jones. We talked about immigration and IQ and institutions in general and how all those factors are interconnect and everything. But yeah, you can find me at Repeal the 20th Century on Twitter, YouTube, Substack, Facebook, and Spotify.
Yes, and so I have the links to your Twitter and YouTube in the description. So after this, if anyone wants to go check out his work, I would encourage you to do so. The interviews are quite nice. And today we are also going to be joined once again by Mr. Panama Hat. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's lovely to have you here, Repeal the 20th. And it's fantastic to be back after quite a long hiatus from the Turnip Seed channel.
Yeah, both of us, I think it's fair to say, we're very busy with Christmas and New Year's.
Yes.
Yeah, so, yeah, and it's been quite a tumultuous time for you in particular. I won't divulge any particular detail. I'll let you do that, of course, but, prayers for our good friend Mr. Hat and his family would be appreciated. I think that would be fair to say.
Yes, it's been a bit of a tumultuous time. I've said in other places what exactly happened, so I'm sure people will already be caught up by now. So we won't dwell on that. But yes, suffice to say, it's been a funny old sort of 2 months-ish.
Yeah.
But we're back now.
Fantastic. So, with all that being said, you can also find Mr. Hat's links in the description at Find My Friends. And are you working on any sort of new publication, Mr. Hat?
Yes, indeed. All the usual stuff is still in the works. I've been putting together some videos for my channel. I may have promoted this one before, but I've had quite a long video in the works for a while, which I'm still writing the script for, called Chesterton, Belloc, and the Jews, which will hopefully be out sometime next week.
Fantastic. We'll see if you still have a channel after that. I know the content is probably not exactly what we're expecting, but that's quite the bold title.
It's simply about the allegations of anti-Semitism that are often leveled at those Catholic authors, and kind of talking about what they actually said and what they actually thought, which is a lot milder than what a lot of people expect. I won't go into too much depth, but it basically says that Jews over Europe don't always behave so well, but it says that they ultimately do deserve a homeland, but you can't go evicting other nations out of their homelands in order to provide one, basically.
Right, and in the modern day that amounts to Another Holocaust, apparently. So,
Yes, I am literally Dr. Goebbels, apparently.
so be on the lookout for Hat's video there. His videos are always quite a wonderful experience. There's always a wonderful selection of music in the background as well. So it's highly cultured. I think would be a good description. So, yeah, and before we start as well, we have the full representation of Protestant, Orthodox, and Catholic on this stream, and we've all come together.
The Holy Trinity.
We have all come together to analyze and critique a famous figure from the 20th century. And the links that we are going to be going through can be seen in chat, and I will also pull stuff up on screen. We have 3 works by MLK Jr., and we have 1 work by our good friend Repeal the 20th, who's on stream with us now, who is that goes over the left kind of being anti-war, but only as a means and not really as any sort of grounded objection. And we'll get into that more later. But first, and the link should be in the private chat for both of you, we have an anti-war speech by MLK, specifically on the Vietnam War, which was the big issue for warfare that he was dealing with at the time, or perhaps his speechwriters were dealing with at the time. So, do you all have that pulled up? And if so, I can start presenting.
Yeah, I'm all good on my end.
All right.
Yep, all the links are up.
Fantastic. So, this is what the article should look like for those in the chat. Hopefully those links worked. I know YouTube can be a bit finicky with that. So, for those that don't know, in the United States education system, there is rhetoric on the AP level, actual writing as a class. And one of the things that will oftentimes be done is you analyze the rhetorical devices used in an MLK speech. I didn't do this exact one, but I remember it was on the docket. Repeal the 20th, maybe you've had some sort of experience with that, or is that outside of your wheelhouse?
I do have a little bit of experience. I didn't take AP US history, but I took AP World History, and yeah, actually, in AP World History, we had to write about MLK. That was like our last kind of essay in the class, was writing about MLK, it was very strange because we barely focused anything on American history throughout the entire class. And even when we got to, the 20th century as our final unit, we barely talked about American history in the 20th century, as we really didn't need to, because, that's the whole reason we had U.S. history. But yet it was about MLK. That was the essay we had to write about. And I remember it being strange at the time, but now I understand why it's there, and it's certainly something, to say the least.
Right, you can't leave out one of the great secular saints of the new regime.
And if you're Episcopalian, you're religious saint.
Yeah. It's quite the tragedy. So, Mr. Hat, I am curious. Do the English or the Welsh, or I don't know how the education systems are devolved over there, do they ever bring up MLK and the civil rights movement in America? Because this is obviously it is native to us, but it would not shock me if it's sort of been dispersed into other Western countries.
In my experience, it's not something that is directly taught about in schools. It does vary, but generally most schools follow a particular pattern of history. We do quite a bit of American history because I suppose we're a province of that empire, so it makes sense. But we don't learn or at least we didn't learn directly about sort of Martin Luther King or the civil rights movement, but it was something that was very much taught via osmosis through media. I mean, it was something that was, seen as this kind of great noble moment in the history of the West, especially because the kind of what we would call the boomer liberal worldview sees it as being one of the kind of great making moments. You have World War II, where the America comes and saves everybody from the Nazis, and then we kind of progress towards utopia. So they always count the fall of apartheid South Africa, American civil rights. Some of them will count the fall of the Soviet Union if they're more on the kind of liberal side, and they'll talk about heading sort of they always imagine that they're heading towards this utopia, as I said. So yes, it wasn't something that was taught to us directly, but it was a big cultural thing. Everybody knew who Martin Luther King was.
Okay.
Even if they didn't know any specific facts about him, we knew that in America it was this big thing, and civil rights was important, and it was a big sort of black pride thing with civil rights. That was basically it.
Yeah, and I'm also getting some input from members of the chat here, good old regulars.
Right.
Vingel saying that they heard about the civil rights movement in Norway. Valtra saying that they were taught about it in between Holocaust classes in the UK. So most people, I think it's fair to say, this should be relevant to, at the very least, so that you can know what the guy said and evaluate from there. Because obviously most people will have a historical narrative. You can't just... It's impossible to be human and just say, I accept the facts and have no narrative that goes behind it of some sort, especially in history. But it's good, even if you're on, say, the right and we have our own counter-narrative, to see what the guy said, to know either how bad or how different the right-wing narrative should be, how different in intensity it should be, and whatnot else. And that's part of why I did this. That's why I did the stream on the Dixiecratic platforms, and various other things. Mr. Hat joined us for the Party Switch stream, which kind of went into the rationale behind everything. So, all of that being said, this is the, let me see what the full title is, Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. Once again, the link should be in the chat near the start. This one in particular. And I think we'll skip the introductory paragraph, just because it's not really that useful. And we will go straight to paragraph 2, if that's all right with everyone here. So,
before we begin, could I just ask, partly for myself and partly for the benefit of the context for the chat?
Yeah.
So this is delivered in 1967 in April.
Yes.
Roughly, what is the Vietnam situation looking like in 1967? So where is America at that point?
Escalating and gruesome is probably the best way to describe it. The media has, for a couple of years now, started to turn towards a very, I'm going to call it the anti-Vietnam War stance, but we'll get into exactly what that means from the perspective of the media. And all that basically means is they're publicizing every little gruesome detail, true or rumor, that they can. Showing, if I remember correctly, they showed live footage as well on television, but that might have been clipped together. I remember it's definitely one of the first wars where there were, where we had such a volume of film. But I think that's fair to say here. 67, it's still the LBJ term.
I was going to say yes.
He is quite famous for escalating.
Right,
and that continued till the bitter end of his presidential term, probably why he didn't try to run again, because he was also being flanked from his left by more pacifistic Democrats. Repeal the 20th, did you have something to add there, or was I seeing things?
No, you're very correct, as we'll mention again when we get to my article. 67 was a major escalation year. 68 was the major escalation year because it was LBJ's last hurrah to be able to escalate this war. And I don't know the exact reason he didn't run again. It could have been that he was getting some flack from Democrats, but it was not a very unified faction, if we're going to be honest. And really, it wasn't until Nixon took power that left-wing opposition became like a real unified movement that like was a threat. And you can look at the dates and the years of the major protests and when they were organized and all these things. And I provides a source that documents that in that article. And you'll see it's all like correlated with Nixon, who from day one was actually de-escalating. A lot of people do not realize this or get taught this, but like, yeah, he would from day one. It was decreasing troops, not increasing. I don't think he ever increased the amount of troops that were in Vietnam his entire presidency.
Right, and that, thankfully, I always talk about how my U.S. history teacher was somewhat of a Jim. The guy very often went to primary sources for absolutely everything that we were taught in there. And one of the things that we did learn, and I didn't realize this was against the grain, the narrative that we kind of came to the conclusion of was that Nixon very much was against escalating the Vietnam War and often de-escalated it throughout his presidency. And then I looked at the other U.S. history classes, and they treated him like a warmonger, which was, I don't know how you can jive the facts there. So, hopefully that's good enough background here. And like Mr. Repeal the 20th said, we will get into it more when we get to his article, which will be not nearly as long as this. So we will go through this quite quickly. The way that I usually comb through these things is I will go through it, just sort of add comments or commentaries or perhaps translate some rhetorical vices into what they would mean if they were said directly. So we'll start with this first paragraph here that I have highlighted. It's the second one in the full speech. MLK says, "I come to this magnificent house of worship tonight because my conscience leaves me no other choice. I join you in this meeting because I am in deepest agreement with the aims and work of the organization which has brought us together. Clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam. The recent statements of your executive committee are the sentiments of my own heart, and I found myself in full accord when I read its opening lines. A time comes when silence is betrayal, and that time has come for us in relation to Vietnam." So, very flowery opening. He has sort of the religious elements that he will always ham up there. No actual affirmation of anything Christian, but words that sound quite like it. House of Worship is where you start to see the decline here. He's no longer calling it by their names. It's just House of Worship, a very general, uniform word instead of church, or if they were meeting somewhere else, naming the exact building. It's just a House of Worship, and this, if you know MLK's seminary education, this is because he's more of a universalist than a Christian. And then, once again, the organization that he's either co-opting, joining, or in league with, clergy and laymen concerned about Vietnam, the exact same thing. What a lot of these lefties did in the 1960s especially, is they would co-opt a sort of a Christian dialect or Christian diction, and use it for their own ends, kind of like, as we'll be discussing, they did with the anti-war movement. And then you get something here that sounds very close to modern rhetoric. A time comes when silence is betrayal. You can't just stand idly by, you have to affirm exactly what it is that the left wants you to affirm. So anything that you all
age-old
wanted to
leftist
add?
tactic. Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. It just strikes me because, it's the same thing they're doing now, isn't it, in America with the Black Lives Matter thing, isn't it? Do you remember that famous incident with the couple in a cafe who were just sat having a coffee or whatever, and the mob swarmed them because they refused to kneel?
Right, yeah. Yeah.
Same kind of thing.
So, Repeal the 20th, anything for that second paragraph?
Yeah, I was going to add that you'll see that it's interesting he picks clerics and laymen concerned about Vietnam as the organization to talk about, and not one that is like very vocal, because at this time they were not engaged as many anti-Vietnam activities as they were in 68 and 69. This specific organization was, very like, well, we're very just concerned about how Vietnam is being fought. What we're really concerned about is, the aims of the war and stuff. And then in 68 and 69, it's a complete flip. Like, we have to end this war right now. And you can see this in a lot of the language that he later talks about in the speech. I don't think at any point he says, like, we actually have to end the war. If I remember correctly, I could be wrong. But, yeah, and to your point about leftists co-opting like very Christian organizations and Christian dialect, that's very true, and especially when they did that when they engaged in anti-war activities, because historically the groups that were anti-war in the United States and really anti-war, as the article lays out, especially with World War I, were Christian groups. It was churches, it was pastors, it was priests who were very vocal, and they were the backbone of the anti-war movement in the early 20th century. And that changed with mostly Vietnam, actually,
Right.
where, you know, the hippie movement kind of co-opted, and anti-war became being anti-war became a hippie thing, rather than, you know, this is like a Christian position that is, you know, universal among all the American faiths.
Right, it was the safe position that the hippies could go to, so they weren't just God-hating communists that sought to destroy every facet of Western civilization. They were also anti-war, so you have to give them that. You know, it's
Yes.
it's almost a contingency for the history writers, if you will. With that, we'll move on to the next paragraph here, very quickly. The truth of these words is beyond doubt, but the mission to which they call us is a most difficult one. Even when pressed by the demands of inner truth, men do not easily assume the task of opposing their government's policy, especially in time of war. Nor does the human spirit move without great difficulty against all the apathy of conformist thought within one's bosom and the surrounding world. Moreover, when the issues at hand seem as perplexing as they often do in the case of this dreadful conflict, we are always on the verge of being mesmerized by uncertainty, but we must move on. So I love this article, or this paragraph right here from this, because he admits that they don't really know what's going on, but they're just going to run with it and treat everything that they come across as fact. And this is specifically what the more lefty types of this movement did. You could very often tell a left-wing from a right-wing anti-war protester by how they would treat the people coming home. The people on the right very often did not have a bone to pick with the conscriptees, with the drafted. It was very often directed towards the government, towards the administrations, the people actually prosecuting the war. The lefties, on the other hand, would come up with every little rumor, document, fabrication, or slight exaggeration coming out of Vietnam, and take that out on the people that went over there on the ground, the people that were forced by the state to go and fight over there. And this is basically King in very rhetorical language, saying they're just going to go on with it. They don't know what's going on. It is uncertain, but they're going to press ahead with their agenda, with their actions, with the things that they are encouraging. So, anything from you two?
No, I think you kind of hit it what King's doing here, because King is very much just a personification of the left wing attitude at the time, specifically in the year of '67.
Alrighty, and then on to the next one. So, King says, and some of us who have already begun to break the silence of the night have found that the calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak. We must rejoice as well, for surely this is the first time in our nation's history that a significant number of its religious leaders have chosen to move beyond the prophesying of smooth patriotism to the high grounds of a firm dissent based upon the mandates of conscience and the reading of history. Perhaps a new spirit is rising among us. If it is, let us trace its movements and pray that our own inner being may be sensitive to its guidance, for we are deeply in need of a new way beyond the darkness that seems so close around us. Now, this is fun. So this trick that he employs here, but we must speak at the end of every sentence, that is a rhetorical device called epistrophe. You can find it used in scripture and all this other stuff. Smooth prophesying of patriotism and all this other language here is a reference to the book of Isaiah, where he's talking about the people of Israel rejecting prophets and then eventually prophesying about rejecting Christ. And let me see, there was something else that I saw. He of course, he alludes to things like humility, a Christian virtue. So And then your inner being. He doesn't say soul here, which is very strange, but that would have worked for what he's trying to say. Very Christian diction. He's employing a lot of rhetorical devices that are quite common in upper class speaking. Basically, it's a implicit or a soft co-opting of Christianity to serve what his purpose is. Because remember, he's not saying that the purpose here is anti-war. It's specifically what this group of people call anti-war, what their agenda is. So, anything from you two?
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say really quickly, it's interesting you focused on those things because I immediately attached to one rhetorical device he uses, which is one that is used a lot by leftists, and it's this kind of appeal to breaking new ground, as it was, and how this has never been done before, that all these clergy leaders have gathered under to call out the government for its actions and not just prophesize smooth patriotism as it were. Yeah. But obviously that's not true at all. And I can't remember the name of the organization, but there was an organization of pastors who were firmly against U.S. intervention in World War I and were probably the most outspoken group about not entering World War I, and were a part of the, ironically, the re-election campaign of Woodrow Wilson, because Woodrow Wilson promised to keep us out of the war at that time. And so, yeah, it's definitely not true that they're the first, but this is just a common tactic that leftists use, is appealing to the breaking new ground. We're having our first gay senator, or we're having our first, trans senator. You see them do this all the time, and this here is just an early incarnation of what is just so common for left-wing rhetoric.
I mean, that phrase sticks out to me, the reading of history. I don't know how intentional it is, but it does have a very kind of scientific Marxist ring to it, I think. There's this idea of the what is it, the march of history, and the inevitability of the leftist outcome.
Right, because it's made to sound common sense here. We're reading the history, we know what's happened. But if you dig deeper, it's really just this is the flow of history. We have to go along with it. Very Whig. Yes.
I also want to note that I'm gonna steal the phrase "our limited vision" to use as a novel title. I think it's quite funny. I like that. All the humility appropriate to our limited vision.
Yeah, and if the right does,
funny phrase.
If it does regain ascendancy, we might be just as limited as the civil rights movement was. Yeah. So, going on to the next paragraph here, King says, "Over the past 2 years, as I have moved to break the betrayal of my own silences and to speak from the burnings of my own heart, as I have called for radical departures from the destruction of Vietnam, many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. At the heart of their concerns, this query has often loomed large and loud. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. Aren't you hurting the cause of your people, they ask. And when I hear them, though I often understand the source of their concern, I am nevertheless greatly saddened, for such questions mean that the inquirers have not really known me, my commitment, or my calling. Indeed, their questions suggest that they do not know the world in which they live." So, he's doing a very common leftist tactic again, where he's saying, oh, what I'm doing is actually really controversial among my own constituents or my own group or my own party or whatnot else. They're all asking, why on earth am I doing this? And the only thing that I, the great public figure, can say to them is that I just have to do this for my heartfelt conviction. This is what I have always stood for. This is my purpose. This is I don't think this is a rhetorical device necessarily, but it is a rhetorical pattern that you will see, a rhetorical call to action. I have always been for this. It's the burnings of my own heart, so he says. Anything from you two?
I will say, as rotten as I think the possible message is, it's quite a keen bit of classical rhetoric. The man was clearly quite well educated.
Well, or a speechwriter was.
Yeah, or a speechwriter was. Yeah, certainly.
There's a reason they use this to teach, and it is very classical. You are very right. So.
Yeah, for sure. I gotta agree with you, and I think what it shows here is that King understands the weight and influence he actually held, because he is speaking like, somebody who has a lot of influence and knows their position, and that really their word among a sizable amount of people is going to be taken as essentially gospel. And, and the best way to do that is to kind of like feign this, I'm taking a risk, I'm sacrificing something, when in reality, he's not sacrificing anything. He is not going to offend anybody who is really going to be the one behind him,
Right, yeah, pushing at an open door. Yeah, so with that, very short paragraph here, probably just providing context if I remember correctly. He says, "In the light of such tragic misunderstanding, I deem it of signal importance to try to state clearly, and I trust concisely, why I believe that the path from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the church in Montgomery, Alabama, where I began my pastorate, leads clearly to this sanctuary tonight." So that might be what we call an appeal to ethos. He's saying, my character means that what I am about to say is true, and you should believe it. All the great things that I did, starting from my humble beginnings back at that Baptist church in nowhere, Alabama, Montgomery, but that's not quite how he rhetorically states this. He's just going to draw upon that, and once again, as usual, drawing upon his Christian underpinnings, if we want to be generous there, which, once again, all lays on the fact that you believe he's a Christian. If you go look at his at what he wrote in his seminary, you might be thinking that what you think is Christianity and what he thought is Christianity are two different things. He completely denied most tenets of, say, the Nicene Creed, the virgin birth, the divinity of Christ, and all of that. But remember, he is just the good pastor from Alabama at the Baptist church that most people in the South are from, good old-fashioned Baptist, that is here to tell you why his interpretation of the war is correct. Anything to add there? Pretty concise paragraph. Alrighty, so next one, now that we have context, ethos, he's appealed to pathos quite a lot of times. He goes on, "I come to this platform tonight to make a passionate plea to my beloved nation. This speech is not addressed to Hanoi or the National Liberation Front. It is not addressed to China or to Russia, nor it is an attempt to overlook the ambiguity of the total situation and the need for a collective solution to the tragedy of Vietnam. Neither is it an attempt to make North Vietnam or the National Liberation Front paragons of virtue, nor to overlook the role they must play in the successful resolution of the problem. While they both may have justifiable reasons to be suspicious of the good faith of the United States, life and history give eloquent testimonies to the fact that conflicts are never resolved without trustful give and take on both sides." So we get into two things here. He is making a very controversial admission in the 1960s that Vietnam has to come together through some sort of reconciliation with communism. Now, you can be... I'm sure most of the people on this panel that are American, Repeal the 20th and I would say that we shouldn't really have been in Vietnam to begin with, but it's an even worse thing to say that the United States should bring about a reconciliation between the communists and the non-communists, because now you are forcing communism to have a foothold. You've gone from bad to even worse. And then he does something else. We have the... let me see here. He says this right here. "We're not going to make North Vietnam or the National Liberation Front paragons of virtue or overlook the role they must play. They have justifiable suspicions. We all conflicts have to give and take on both sides. This is just not how history plays out. This is how the liberal or the post-war consensus plays out, where we no longer want conflict. We can all just come together and peacefully resolve our issues. We can find a middle spot between liberal democracy and full communism that everyone will be happy with. This is probably the most Whig history view of history right here. Uh, all conflicts are never resolved without trustful give and take on both sides. This is especially egregious given the two wars that had previously rocked the world before this. So, anything from you two that I may have missed means elaborating.
I mean, it does seem sort of strange because, like as you say, he's moving towards this very internationalist, very Whiggish understanding of the situation in Vietnam, isn't he? I mean, this almost sounds like something you would hear now, or at least in the last 20 years, about some sort of international conflict where some sort of global think tank leader comes out and says, "Oh, we need a collective international solution to this country's problem and this country's problem."
But that's only if the insurgents are left-wing. If it was a right-wing insurgency, there would be calls for global police operations or whatever they call them.
Well, I mean, do you have any idea what MLK wrote about South Africa, for example? I'm asking because I actually don't know.
I haven't read his work. I'm more familiar with Bobby Kennedy because he was big on that, and they both basically hated each other, but they shared a lot of the same rhetoric. We could
right.
That might be like a part 2 stream there.
Okay.
But it would not shock me if he spoke against South Africa. But remember, this is the 60s. He never made it to the. There were still vocal supporters of segregation in America, let alone South Africa.
I mean, the South African apartheid situation, I don't think it quite taken off yet because I mean, I know, I suppose because they'd become a republic, but I don't know. As you say, it would have to be something to look into. But yeah, it would be interesting to see the difference in rhetoric.
Right, and I will say we'll go for a couple more paragraphs, and then we'll go to Repeal the 20th article because he has children. He is a very dutiful parent by the sounds of it, and we'll probably have to leave early. So we'll go through his article, then we will revisit the stuff just Hat and I. So whenever we leave this speech, we aren't abandoning it. So King goes on. Tonight, however, I wish not to speak with Hanoi and the National Liberation Front, but rather to my fellow Americans. Since I am a preacher by calling, I suppose it is not surprising that I have 7 major reasons for bringing Vietnam into the field of my moral vision. There is, at the outset, a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I, and others, have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through poverty program. There were experiments, hopes, new beginnings. Then came the build-up in Vietnam, and I watched this program broken and eviscerated, as if it were some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. Now, this is what they will always oscillate to because it is good populist rhetoric to say we oppose everything that is going on that we don't like, that is taking away from our program because it hurts the poor. And we all like the poor. They can't fend for themselves. They are there. They need our help. So that's why we oppose the space program. That's why we oppose foreign intervention, all this other stuff. Now, this is quite hilarious because if you know anything about the history of the Great Society, while the Vietnam War was happening the entire time, these things were by no means less than what they were advertised. They were quite robust in their application. They were extremely interventionist socially. They had an absolute ton of money poured into them in Medicaid extension, Medicare. You had expansions of Social Security. You had money being thrown at specific regions, oftentimes slums and ghettos that were just being thrown at them in hopes that the increase in money would help them. And King here is saying that that is not enough. This war is taking away good, precious money that could be going to the American equivalent of the NHS. That's the best way that I can put it for our English audience. So, anything from you two?
It's it's odd because there is sometimes a similar rhetoric used by kind of more mainstream right-wing politicians when they say like we need to slash foreign aid and money to the third world or whatever because there's poor people here. Obviously I know that these are not really comparable as such, but it's just odd the way that you hear rhetoric, the same rhetoric popping up in different contexts. Because I mean, as you say, that is especially a big thing on the American left, isn't it? Where they say, why do we have the space program when we have all these poor people? Why are we building? I remember there's famous. There's a famous old clip from the 30s where somebody's like, "Why are we building the Empire State when there's Hoovervilles within sight of it and things like that?" But as you say, it's fairly cheap rhetoric. I think in this context because the left always uses it kind of disingenuously.
Right.
But yeah, it does come around again.
Populist rhetoric is very popular whenever you have to speak directly to people. Repeal the 20th. Is there anything you wanted to add on that paragraph? I think we've covered a lot of the tropes that we'll be needing for your article now.
Yes. I just wanted to briefly read a line that actually, where he further expands upon this, and I think basically completely gives us a really good idea of MLK's thinking and rhetoric he uses to be, quote unquote, anti-war. And
this is later in the speech, so I can get it up.
Yeah. It's quite towards the end, but I can just read it aloud. Yeah. The first is this kind of positive revolution, but that's not the line I want to read.
Yeah, okay. I've got the paragraph.
Yeah, it's we must not engage in a negative anti-communism, but rather in a positive thrust for democracy, realizing that our greatest defense against communism is to take offensive action in behalf of justice. We must, with positive action, seek to remove those conditions of poverty, insecurity, and injustice, which are the fertile soil in which the seed of communism grows and develops. And as you'll probably talk about in the article on MLK with economic justice, you'll come to realize that what his vision of positive action against on the behalf of justice is essentially the same thing that communists in the United States are saying, and that's the reason why MLK is revered to an even greater extent among communists than he is the normal population. And
right.
He's kind of using the anti-communist rhetoric of the era in a way to just say, well, if we really want to defeat communism, actually we do my version of soft communism, and
right.
then communism will never take root.
Right.
And didn't Huey Long say something along these lines? It was like my share the wealth program is the only defense against communism this country's got, something like that.
I believe he said something similar. Yes.
There's a sort of right wing that does this, where we're going to defeat communism by just giving them slight concessions towards communism. This is the same argument that often gets touted that Bismarck made. We're going to institute a welfare program in the German Empire to ensure that there isn't a communist revolution. What great wonders that did for a few decades down the line. I'm
going to stop the thief who's trying to take stuff in my house by giving him a third of my possessions, and then he'll go away.
Yeah. So
same logic.
With all of that, our good friend here, we have a article that is on Mises.org, and it is in the chat right here if you want to go and see it for yourself and follow along. I don't know how much longer you have, Repeal the 20th, so can we go through it? Is there
I got time to go through it.
Okay, all right. So, It is your article. If you want to read aloud, we can go paragraph by paragraph. Feels like it's a bit weird for me to read it while you are here.
Yeah, I can go ahead and read it. So I'll just start out with the beginning. The left is often assumed to be a major force against war and intervention, to the point that many on the right and libertarians try to appeal to the left based on the agreement on the issue. This assumption ignores how the left's opposition to war has mostly been when politically beneficial. I'll keep going because I don't think there's anything to comment there. But while leftists can point to a few left-wing ideologues who started anti-war movements or protests in periods when there was a significant left-wing presence in the movements, leftists in actual positions of power have been at the forefront of warmongering U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the 20th century. Looking as far back as President William McKinley, the first progressive Republican was a faux anti-imperialist who used revolutions in Latin America and the Southeast Asia as a pretext to expand American territories and resources, which led to the Spanish-American War. This war is where the more left-wing journalists and the state formed their relationship to provide ample justification in the eyes of the public, which has since been titled yellow journalism.
Right, and before we go on there, this is something that Mr. Stephen Carson and I have touched on his channel, Radical Liberation, where we go into the start of the Spanish-American War after all the previous parts of warfare by the United States since the war between the states. Now, this is interesting because this is a fact that doesn't get emphasized enough, is that William McKinley, the guy that ended up bringing Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam into the American sphere, did present himself as an anti-imperialist who only declared war and took those territories because he had to politically. And I'm sure Mr. Panama Hat, who's quite a learned expert on Spanish society and as well as their empire, could tell you how integral these territories were to Spain. Losing Cuba and the Philippines wasn't like Britain losing some far-off island that no one knew about. It was seen oftentimes as an integral part of the empire in Spain.
Well, I mean, it was integral. When I say integral, I don't mean so much in the sense of sort of in a material sense in terms of the economy, as much as it was integral to a Spanish conception of itself and a sense of what it meant to be Spanish and Spanish pride, because it was intrinsically tied to the idea of the Spanish as the great conquerors of European history. The conquistadores and the conquests of Spain and the conquest of Cuba, the Philippines, etc. These were all, when America just sort of wrenched them away in one fell swoop. It was kind of equivalent to if I were to just hack off one of your arms and one of your legs, basically. It would just a total psychological moral shock to Spain. So yes, it was kind of difficult to put into words, I think.
So yeah, sorry for the interjection there. I just felt like that might be good for the audience to know exactly what you mean by this.
No, yeah, for sure. And that source that I actually linked there, it talks a lot about William McKinley and like his history of this tactic that has become very commonplace among left-wing ideologues of, we have to intervene to protect this, bludgeoning revolution that is, fighting for dignity and everything. This is the same tactic the KGB used throughout the 20th century in order to justify intervention from the Soviets to assist, communist revolutions across the world. And it was a very successful and rhetorical tactic because we talk a lot about, the CIA and its assistance in coupping against other governments, but we talk very little about the KGB and engaging in the exact same behavior.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't fit the sort of ascendant narrative.
Yeah, exactly. And even right-wingers fall into this trap, unfortunately, and they don't even talk about how it's still a behavior going on, not with the KGB, obviously, because the KGB doesn't exist anymore, but, China is currently involved in co-opting governments in Africa as a way to secure mining rights. And we talk very little about it, even though it's a pretty major issue, especially because, many of the things we, value, especially lithium, are the things that they're taking over mining rights of. So,
right. So if you'd like to continue.
Yes. So at the turn of the century, the left liberal intellectuals, particularly in Britain, were a small minority that was drowned out within the left by those who supported British involvement in the First World War. In America, most pacifists and anti-war activists, despite being portrayed as communists, came from religious movements and far exceeded left-wingers in terms of those who did not support the war, as their churches supplied many conscientious objectors.
Yeah, and that's a very quick point here. Those religious protests against World War I were usually coming from the perspective of, it was just a few generations ago that we were over there. They share the exact same religion as us. There is no need for us to go over there and slaughter them in such great volume.
Yes.
Very much not the sort of rhetoric you'd hear today about war.
There was and this continued into World War II too, of the whole no more brother wars concept, but it was very literal. It was and then especially it was very literal for the more recent immigrants, but even founding stock, who were like, literally, what is the point of this war? Why would we get involved in an internal dispute among Europeans who, for all intents and purposes, are just like us? It would be like if the United States government intervened in like some dispute between Texas and Alabama. And so, a lot of people found it very strange, especially religious leaders who were very sensitive to the fact of, this is our kin. Why would we do this?
Right.
But I'll keep going. President Woodrow Wilson drew more conservative and religious support in his re-election for keeping the country out of the war. This was certainly the case as his re-election campaign slogan ironically became, "He kept us out of the war." The quote becomes ironic when Wilson, a progressive politician, quickly joined war efforts after re-election in April 1917 when he called on Congress to declare war on Germany. He cited two incidents for this 180 in the policy. First was the sinking of the Lusitania in the English Channel, which left the harbor despite warnings of attacks from both the British and German governments if it was to enter what was currently a war zone. The second was the Zimmerman telegram, which proposed an alliance between Mexico and Germany to attack the United States if the U.S. were to enter the war.
Right,
go ahead.
I was just going to say the Zimmerman telegram is an interesting one because it was verified, but the original leak to the press and the wider public was only from the British government. So you have to keep in mind the initial sort of publication of the Zimmerman telegram was a bit different than the one you will now see in the history books, which has the actual thing there. It's definitely an example of a media apparatus drumming up war support for a war that they want to go into.
Yeah, for sure. When I was doing the research for this article, it was actually the first time I ever read the Zimmerman telegram. Before this, I had never read it. And I actually assumed that it said what, history classes teaches you it says. Because history classes very much teach that, like, it was like, imminent. Germany was ready, was preparing an attack and was saying in this telegram, hey, we're going to attack. But when you read it, it's very much of a like, well, here's worst case scenario. In case this thing we really don't want to happen and we're going to strive as hard as we can to not happen and do everything we can so it doesn't happen, we'll do this thing. And
right.
Like the language is very clear. Like Germany is constantly saying, like, in the event of this thing we really don't want to happen, that we really hope doesn't happen, we'll do this thing.
there are so many of those agreements in the modern day right now that if we were to declare war because of that, because if we entered a war against this guy and then another one joined in, we would be at war with basically the entire world.
Yes, for sure. I mean, Russia. Let's look at the Ukraine war right now. People talk a lot about. I think it's Article 5 of NATO, and they make the memes about Poland. Activating Article 5.
Yeah.
Essentially, that is the exact same thing as what was proposed in the Zimmerman telegram. If that's a justified reason for declaring war, well, then Russia has a justified reason to declare war on Poland, and NATO, and ourselves. So I don't I don't think it's a very good argument for war, and I think if you apply it to basically any modern situation, people are going to go, well, that's insane. Why would we do that? But it works back then.
It doesn't quite fit the universalizing principle, does it?
Exactly. All right, so I'll go on to this next paragraph, which is, now both examples invoke some clear antagonism from Wilson and the U.S. towards Germany. The first required the Lusitania to enter a war zone with a civilian ship, despite warnings from both sides that they would not be protected. Second, Germany does not propose a first strike on the U.S., but admits it intends to keep the U.S. out of the war and only proposes a worst-case scenario in which it tries to gain Mexico as an ally. Neither would be sufficient to claim America's declaration of war was a defensive one. And this very much goes into the Second World War with the second paragraph of, we see much of the same with the Second World War, largely caused by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Just a brief comment on this. I've actually gotten a lot of pushback on this from people. It's very debated on whether or not the Treaty of Versailles actually caused the war itself. But what I was trying to say here in the beginning is it created the unique condition within Germany that caused Germany to be aggressive.
I don't know how you would push back on saying the post World War I diplomatic conditions caused World War II. That just seems to be a necessity.
Yeah, I think some people thought I was trying to say that the Treaty of Versailles directly caused World War II. Through I can't remember. There was a comment on this article that I remember reading. It was a very strange argument, but I was like, no, it's as simple as Germany would not be the country it was up to World War II if it wasn't for what happened with the Treaty of Versailles. But I'll keep going. Created by Wilson, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a progressive as well, also feigned a sense of neutrality at the start of the war, from supporting aggressive embargo policies and Navy deployments in the Pacific to combat Japan without direct measures, to the Lend-Lease program, which supplied the Allies before the official U.S. involvement. FDR acted despite the neutrality acts of the 1930s, to provoke the Axis into attacking the U.S. by making the U.S. neutrality virtually untrue without an official declaration of war. I do want to comment on the neutrality acts of 1930s were a joint effort by conservative factions in both the Republican and Democratic Party to do everything we can to keep us out of this war. It was a lot of the same overlap of people who were anti-war in World War I who were pushing these acts. There was very little left-wing support or any engagement for these acts. It was a very right-wing push. And as I'll mention in the next paragraph, of a really big push by the America First Committee, which could not be called left-wing by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I might do a stream where we go through their newspaper articles from the, was it Saturday Morning Post?
Yes.
Or evening, perhaps.
All right, and into the next one is, the opposition to FDR's warmongering was also not from the left, but from the right, with the America First Committee's campaign to keep the U.S. out of the war. Additionally, congressional support for neutrality was greatest among Republicans. Finally, looking at when the left's anti-war convictions were greatest, In the Vietnam War, we can see that the timing of their protests seemed to coincide with the presidency of Nixon. While protests against the war in Vietnam existed before 1970, it was not until Nixon announced an invasion into Cambodia, a new offensive in the region, that the New Left's protests became widespread. During Johnson's presidency, the movement was substantially smaller.
And I'm glad you bring up that point, because this is definitely how you can tell that this is politically motivated against Nixon and not anti-war itself. Just because Johnson single-handedly turned this from some sort of like a somewhat known proxy conflict that was across the world. We weren't. It wasn't really rocking American society. And then by the end of his term, we had the draft in full force. We had the media mobilized entirely against North Vietnam. It was a main thing on every newspaper, and most people were just going along with it, and you had minor resistance to the drafts and all that, but only after 1968, with the presidency of Nixon, do you finally seeing this thing going hot. The protests and the movement, that is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. It was definitely a complete switch there as soon as Nixon took the oath of office in the attitude.
That's all I had to add there. If you wanted to keep going.
Yes. I'll go. So, again, we see that the real substantial opposition to the war came from the right, not the left, as Nixon himself in the 1968 election put a public face of condemnation for further involvement in Vietnam. Of course, as we know, Nixon betrayed such a trust and continued the war despite the assurance to the anti-war right that he was surrounded by the right people. Though this would ultimately be his administration that ended the war and begun removing troops as early as 1969. I want to mention, though, that that article, that the right people is quoted right there, that's actually an article from Rothbard talking about
Nixonian socialism.
Yes, it's a very great article that he wrote, kind of talking about how at the time, the Randyites were very much assuring him that he should support Nixon because the right people are in power. Don't worry. The right people are in power. We're going to win, and all these things. And, it turned out that it wasn't completely true. But I think Rothbard is a little harder on Nixon than he actually should have been because, as I mentioned earlier, Rothbard or Nixon actually ended up being pretty anti-war in effect, in the sense that Vietnam de-escalated because of him.
Yeah, and that would make sense because your political base is half between war hawks and people that are anti-war. You can't really go all in one direction and still remain the president.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, he was facing a lot of different people in his ear. I mean, you got to remember, this is when Donald Rumsfeld, Karl Rove, and Dick Cheney were all getting their start. Was right around this time in politics.
Right, and then electorally as well, 1968 was the three-way election. And you had a lot of the South was going towards the American Party, which is basically the Dixiecrats. They tend to be much more internationalist than the Republican. They're called isolationists now, and I will have a very great viewer of the channel, Mr. Grant Book, saying they weren't isolationists. That's not quite historically real. But that's what their policy tended to be, is they tended to be more inward-looking. So you had those two coalitions that he was trying to appeal to in various different effects. You can't go all one and not the other and expect to be elected. So despite the rhetoric, I'd agree with you. He tended to be more effectively anti-war than basically any president since Truman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is unbelievably true. Though a lot of people will argue that it is a large in part due to the unpopularity of his presidency rather than him actually wanting to do it, which is fine. I care about the results, not the reason for the results most of the time.
So that's all I had to add there.
Great. I'll go on. And so this is not to say that Nixon was anti-war, far from it, but it was not the left who were the ones ending Vietnam, but the right, as it had been in previous wars of the 20th century. As Rothbard characterized during the 1992 election between George Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton, that the right had a better history of keeping us out of conflicts than the left, even if marginal. His words remain true, even as Bush Jr. would enter us into the two wars at the beginning of the 21st century. This is because his successor, Barack Obama, would go on to only escalate the conflicts and try to drag us into even more as he tapped into the anti-war left. I want to mention again, I have another Rothbard article I'm citing there where he actually came out in support of George Bush Sr. As the headline says, any sensible American has one real choice, and it's George Bush Sr. And it's not because George Bush Sr. is, some, paleo-libertarian or paleo-conservative who's going to keep us out of these foreign conflicts and, is for, small government or something like that. It literally is just, he has a slightly better record than Bill Clinton on these issues.
Right.
He's slightly less of a maniac and psychopath than Bill Clinton.
Yeah, realistically, you're ending up with one or the other, so you might as well go for the less bad option that won't get us involved in Bosnia and Croatia and Serbia.
Exactly. Yes. And that was his argument. And, it becomes even more ironic because while George Bush Sr. didn't have the great record, George Bush Jr. was way worse. But then we look at Barack Obama, who was, campaigning on kind of this tapping into the anti-war left, so to speak. And then when he took office, he just made all those conflicts worse and started
new ones. Yeah,
exactly. And if he could, he probably would have started even more. I bet he really wanted to start something in Ukraine, but politically could not. And that's relevant to the last the last paragraph of the article, which kind of shows that this was made early into the Ukraine war. But the mask of anti-war leftism has completely fallen as the Ukraine war-Russia conflict goes on. Democrats have consistently more likely to support aggressive foreign policy around the conflict than Republicans. This is especially true on the topic of no-fly zones, as more Democrats support them than Republicans. Though this does not mean the Republicans are completely against escalating this conflict, as a Florida Republican in Congress said she supported a no-fly zone despite not knowing what it means, the numbers are still relatively high for Republicans. We can see that the bulk of opposition again is on the right, proving Rothbard's point in 1992 right again.
Right, and that's this is going to be especially pertinent to the topic that we started with MLK Jr., because a lot of these people would turn away from the anti-war movement to support foreign intervention so long as it was to drift leftward. And they didn't really come out and say this directly, but it's a coincidence when they're just against the Vietnam War when we're fighting the communist side, and then they're for various Middle Eastern interventions when it's supporting a leftward side, say, later on in a few decades. That might be a coincidence just this once, but then you see as we get involved in more places like Africa, like more places in the Middle East, parts of Oceania, parts of Southeast Asia again, and this same pattern plays out time and time again. As the side we are fighting is communist, they go anti-war, and if we are propping up a liberal regime in a monarchical or an authoritarian country, they suddenly like the war. It starts to turn more into a pattern rather than a coincidence. So this article is fantastic for illustrating this, just because you can see that even with their rhetoric, where they will tap into this supposed ethereal, mythical anti-war left that will definitely get us the same place as the old anti-war tradition, somehow we only end up in more and more conflicts that are for gayer and gayer reasons. So that's specifically what I wanted to use with this article here. So thank you, sir. I might ask, how much time do you still have? Because
I'm probably going to have to jump out shortly, but I do want to make a comment on this kind of the last paragraph I had there, because I think it really is emblematic of Rothbard's key point that is, we kind of only have two options realistically, and that's Republicans and Democrats. And, Republicans are the ones who have been better on this issue consistently. Even during the George Bush years, at the very beginning, the first people who were like principally anti-war were Republicans. It wasn't until we got closer to midterms and eventually the presidential election that we really saw more left-wing people speaking out against the Iraq War and Afghanistan. But even now with Ukraine, if a Republican gets elected in 2024 and this war is still going on, you're going to see a complete flip from a lot of Democrats who were very vocal about, we need to send as much money and arms to Ukraine as possible, to softening their rhetoric to, maybe we should, de-escalate, find a peaceful solution. Maybe Ukraine will have to give up some, concessions and all this stuff. And that's what's going to probably happen, though the likelihood of a Republican president in 2024 is very unlikely, honestly, if I had to say. But yeah, I think the key point here is, and you can even see it all the way back to MLK, is that really the anti-war point is used as like a position to gain other areas. As you saw with MLK, it wasn't focusing on, here are the effects of this foreign policy, here's why it's wrong. It's, well, instead of doing this foreign policy, let's do economic justice. It's always a card to be played in favor of other positions. It's not the position itself. It's not an end in itself. It is a means to an end. It's hard to believe any leftists when they say, I'm anti-war. Are you anti-war because there's a Democrat in office, or are you anti-war because you want to make that Democrat more progressive or more communist? Which is it? And specifically, I think MLK coming out as early as he was as anti-war was because, he wanted to make LBJ more progressive. You have a Texas Democrat who, got the Civil Rights Act passed, but only after a lot of concessions to Republicans and conservatives and cutting out a lot of the things MLK actually wanted. Overall, MLK was very disappointed with the Civil Rights Act because it made a lot of concessions to get that number of Republicans. I think it was 82% of Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act, and it was something like 64% of Democrats.
Right, and it's the story behind that's interesting, and I can just share a little bit of it right now. You had a Hubert Humphrey, who was the Senate Majority Leader, the Democratic leader, and you had was it Ev Durkinson or something like that? I forget the name. It's quite strange, but basically you have the both the majority and minority leader in the Senate making concessions with each other in order to close the debate around the Civil Rights Act and then just pass it through. Because the Southern strategy was basically to just debate it to death until one, either you've stalled for so long that other business needs to happen, or two, the country just finally sees all the things that they're pointing out in Congress as time goes on, that they would just turn against it. We had a tradition in the 20s and 30s where a filibuster was nothing to do with the topic. And then you had Richard Russell Jr. from Georgia, who sort of took over the Southern bloc. And then he basically just said, if you're going to filibuster this, we're going to go through every little minute detail and say why it's bad in the bill. Which, I don't know if it worked too terribly well, but it took basically all the Republicans and all the remaining non-Southern Democrats to shut them down. So that was a lot of political power to get past them.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the story. I don't know if there's any good books on it because I've only ever read articles on it. If not, that is something that I think somebody should definitely write about. But the story of like LBJ's kind of conquest and humiliation of people to get the Civil Rights Act passed is definitely an interesting one and definitely an insight into how is it that we accomplish things within the body of Congress, because LBJ is an enemy worth learning from in that regard.
Yeah,
and
he was specifically the only figure that could have broken the sort of conservative coalition preventing civil rights acts from being passed. He is definitely someone that the right should study more. Not to do the exact same things, but just to know this is what can happen, and you can kind of see the thought process behind it, so that maybe one day we could bypass legal structures in order to get through what we need through.
Yeah, for sure. And again, though, part of that ended up being that making these concessions that MLK was very angry about, because I think one of them was about applying, I think, quotas to businesses, like racial quotas.
Yeah.
I believe that was one thing that was cut out that MLK said should have stayed in.
Not just businesses, but also government as well, if I remember correctly.
Yes. And there are all kinds of things that angered MLK and would have inspired him to give that speech that he did give in '67, rather than when most leftists began giving speeches and protests against Vietnam, which was in late '68 and early '69 and onward.
Yeah. So, with all that being said, thank you very much for the article that you provided here and the other insights that you gave. If we do a part 2, I'll definitely be inviting you back, because this was I feel like the anti-war knowledge that you have will come in useful, because I just know the politics. I don't really keep the protests memorized as well. And just so that we can have a clean cutoff, I've had a couple of people that have left suddenly on stream before. It's not quite organized. Is there anything you'd like to shill or advertise or point people towards before signing off?
I think the main thing would be just check out my YouTube channel if you want to, and my Spotify it's all my episodes of interviews are also on Spotify, Odyssey, and Substack. I am hopefully going to have some stuff out on my Substack soon. Episodes of my channel will probably resume when I return to my actual home in February. As well, I would say if you want a book to read more on this kind of concept of the left not really being the anti-war ones, I would read Tom Wood's books, Those Who Dared to Say No to War, which is a bunch of American writings from different anti-war people. And if you just look at the backgrounds of most of the people in the book, these are not left-wingers by any means. I would suggest that was probably the best book. As for a book on MLK, I can't really think of any that I would share, but I would say I would look into MLK's affiliations with the Communist Party of the U.S., which I'm sure if we do a part 2 will definitely be mentioned.
Yes, fantastic. So I don't mean to kick you off. I just do want to.
Yes.
I told you I would have you on for about an hour, and Hat and I would go on for longer, and it's been an hour and 18. So by all means, go enjoy the time that you have with your family.
Yes.
And thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Repeal the 20th.
Yep.
And I can say you are for anyone that is skeptical, he is a very, very entertaining Twitter follow.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, you're very welcome. So, yeah, thank you for joining us once again, and we will definitely be in touch soon.
Great.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, have a blessed day, everyone.
Yes, you too, Mr. Repeal. And
Goodbye.
Mr. Hat and I will be continuing back at MLK. Is there? You were quiet for a little bit, and I know that American history isn't exactly your wheelhouse, Mr. Hat. But is there anything you wanted to add there? Now that we aren't on a time crunch so much.
Not particularly. I was mainly listening because it was just very interesting to me, and I don't have anything sort of direct to add. But it's very fascinating. I will have to read the article over a few times, I think, because I've never really heard it put out like that.
Yeah, and he had a lot of links. I don't know if you noticed the hyperlinks that were in the articles. There's a lot of reference material there. So for the chat that might have just joined in or something like that, this is the link that we are going to be reading from. This is MLK's anti-Vietnam War speech, quote unquote, and we are, I think, probably about a quarter of the way through it or something like that. But we've touched a lot of the tropes, so we'll just go through this very thoroughly, because I am tired, quite frankly, of going on stream saying these things and then people saying, yeah, but you didn't exactly quote every part of the article, so it's a straw man. So I'm doing that here, not just for them, but also so that we can know exactly what was being said by the people that shaped the last century, what most of us would consider detrimentally. So, anything else to add, Mr. Hat, before we go on?
No, but I will say this paragraph we have on screen now. I think this is something I was going to bring up anyway, because it's something that often gets cited in a lot of writings about Vietnam around this time and how it related to segregation. Because I'm aware that am I right in thinking that the military had been desegregated for some time at this point?
Yes, that would have been President Truman in the late 40s or the early 50s, I forget which. And I'll read out this article real quick so that people know what we're talking about. Picking up where we left off, King says, "Perhaps a more tragic recognition of reality took place when it became clear to me that the war was doing far more than devastating the hopes of the poor at home. It was sending their sons and their brothers and their husbands to fight and to die in extraordinarily high proportions relative to the rest of the population. We were taking the black young men who had been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. And so we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. And so we watch them in brutal solidarity, burning the huts of a poor village, but we realize they would hardly live on the same block in Chicago. I cannot be silent in the face of such cruel manipulation of the poor." Now this is absolutely infuriating to me, because King is playing a coin game where on one side of the coin, South Vietnam is an evil dictatorial regime that it goes against American liberties, American foundational philosophy to support them anyways, but also somehow South Vietnam is much more liberal and integrated than Harlem or Chicago or Southeast Georgia or whatnot else. And this is especially egregious because we had one of the most federally integrative, federally interventionist policies passed in 1965. If just a year before this was written, if I remember correctly, this would be 1966. It's at the top of the article. Where basically the federal government made a commission to go through each county and force various measures of integration to make sure that blacks could get to the voting booth in greater numbers. Now, this is not good enough for King, once again, because if you are in this movement, you just keep pushing and keep pushing for more and more and more. This is what the left does all the time. If you give them an inch, they will try to take a mile. And you have another call here that is very radical for the time. You have to remember, it's been let's see, 1957 to 1966. It's been 9 years since the first Civil Rights Act was passed since the 1800s. And here we have King calling for integration of communities, of neighborhoods. He's saying that not only do people not have to be segregated, they have to be mixed together. So this is quite the radical flip from him here at the bottom part of the paragraph.
Well, I mean, I know that in a lot of the media around Vietnam, there's always this concept that it went a long way to discredit segregation as a kind of credible concept, because everyone was watching white and black men serving together in the armed forces on TV every night. So they were sort of like, well, if we have this, then why don't we just, why do we still have segregation here? That's generally the tone that comes across anyway.
And that's definitely true for most parts of the country. It's just here's a way to think about it. Segregation was a regional thing. The laws varied by region. Some didn't even have them at all. Some places it was informal, and less so as the war went on. You're very correct. And then in the South, sometimes it was city by city, county by county, to where it's perfectly possible that you could have lived in a county in, say, Tennessee or Alabama, and you could see these things on the television. But the segregation laws were already, to begin with, so lax, even without the Civil Rights Acts, that it was just business as usual. It was very possible that it could be normal in some parts of the South that blacks and whites could fight in the same army or the same unit or the same division. Some people might question as to whether or not that was wise. The sort of should the empire mix different languages and ethnicities and backgrounds into the same units, or should they segregate them? That's imperially there are merits on both sides of that. One of the issues you can come across with is like Britain in World War I, where entire towns disappear just because they were all put into the same regiment. Or you can have the Austrian conundrum of there are so many different people in this regiment that they can't do anything. It's hard to communicate with them. Not quite the same on either side here in the American context. But that's like an objection you could get. And then of course there were parts of the South where it was seen as madness. So it's very regional, whereas integration was standardized across the board. Every part of the country had to adhere to these laws about segregation and integration.
I see.
So, hopefully that clears up a little bit, but you are right. And that's something that you even see in World War II. Despite the fact that most people, black or white, wanted to maintain segregation after the war, they had a respect for each other that perhaps they would not have had beforehand. That's sort of like the old soldiers' memoirs of they would come across terrible people of all kinds, but usually you would find people that had come across different races that were more respectable to serve alongside. That's not like a lefty talking point or a progressive talking point. That's just what happened. It's hard to fight in a war alongside somebody and not develop some sort of camaraderie for them. I'm sure that, say, the English and the Welsh might be somewhat similar in their imperial wars.
Well, I mean, the English and Welsh were never really segregated as such.
Or perhaps Irish. I was just trying to come up with a regional difference.
It's a very different sort of thing, because you encounter people all over the British Isles. But I think that, as you say, it was kind of in the American sense of the desegregated armed forces, it was a sense of more of a mutual respect, than anything else that I think was gained from it.
Right. So
that would be the main thing. Although I have to. So were there African American officers at this point, or was it just fighting units?
I'm fairly certain that there were.
Okay.
But I would have to double check. I'm not a military historian by any means. I've just I know the political side of this, which is why I wanted to do it. So I would be shocked if there wasn't, is all I would say.
Okay.
So that's the thing in this paragraph, though, is he pulls quite the switch where on the one hand, South Vietnam is this evil repressive regime that the Americans should never be involved with. It's basically colonialism. And then on the other hand, it's so much more integrated and progressive than the United States. It can't be both, but we're going to flip the coin and see which one we get for this paragraph. And then, of course, down here, uh, calls for integration and living. It's not enough that you can choose where to live now. You must live next to each other. Getting rid of actual benefits of diversity when you have different groups of people that live among themselves, but different groups nonetheless. You get an actual functioning culture, whereas if you just intersperse everyone so totally, you end up with the modern day where there is no culture. It's all just uniformly homogenized. Any sort of distinctions or differences are superficial in nature.
Yes.
So I'll go on one more paragraph, and I might have to have you filled for me to go refill my water, if that's
No
all
worries.
right. King goes on. He says, "My third reason moves to an even deeper level of awareness, for it grows out of my experience in the ghettos of the North over the last 3 years, especially the last 3 summers. As I have walked among the desperate, rejected, and angry young men, I have told them that Molotov cocktails and rifles would not solve their problems. I have tried to offer them my deepest compassion, while maintaining my conviction that social change comes most meaningfully through nonviolent action. But they ask, and rightfully so, what about Vietnam? They ask if our own nation wasn't using massive doses of violence to solve its problems, to bring about the changes it wanted. Their questions hit home, and I knew that I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government. For the sake of those boys, for the sake of this government, for the sake of the hundreds of thousands trembling under our violence, I cannot be silent." And here's the trope where we said this is a means to an end for the left. This is why he's doing it. He says it very directly here. I'm only talking about this because I want to address violence in the ghettos through government action. But our government is causing violence elsewhere, so I have to talk about that first. That's what this middle section boils down to, if we're being honest and not being rhetorical, to be very frank here.
Yes, it actually isn't really supported. Its weight isn't supported by what's been said so far, I don't think. Or this
Right.
this sudden invocation of the U.S. government as the greatest oppressor, seems very strange.
Yeah, and I mean, I know it's sort of like a righty boomer trope to say, the Soviet Union is the worst thing to ever happen, but I don't think that our death count quite reaches the Soviet levels, especially by 1966.
No. I mean, also, this isn't really an accurate treatment of the situation in Vietnam. I mean, I don't know enough about the geopolitics to say if I'm pro or against the American decision to go into Vietnam formally, but I will say that, I mean, he isn't really giving it any treatment at all as the complicated issue that it was. There was a reason. It wasn't just like America woke up one day and decided to invade Vietnam, which is how most leftists seem to see it. It was a long, decades-long process of aid and specialist training, which eventually rose to the level of, thousands of troops on the ground. This is not, and he isn't treating it that way at all. He isn't talking about the fear of encroaching communism in Asia or anything like that. He's just talking about war bad, basically.
Right, and he even admits up here he doesn't know exactly what's going on, but by his own admission, he doesn't need to, because this is just a tool for him.
It does sound like, I mean, I'm not saying this is literally what happened, but it's what it sounds like. It sounds like somebody who can make a pretty speech, receiving some sort of. It's as if he's sort of been paid to give a pretty speech about how violence is bad and we have to end the war, basically.
Yeah,
because I don't believe that Martin Luther King was incapable of grasping the situation and giving it a more legitimate treatment. This just sounds. This sounds like the words of somebody else to me, or the words of somebody who is acting purely in ideological cynicism, rather than giving it the treatment it needs.
Right, and even his circle, his speechwriters, his helpers, and all this other stuff, the people that we know about, they definitely knew what was going on. They knew the history of the region, the French sort of colonies that were there that did actively help the region, much like the British helped India. They knew about the slaughters against the French colonists that were there as World War II went on, and then into the post-war era. They knew about the why France wanted to stay there, sort of like a buffer against China to its direct north. And they knew why the U.S. had an interest in the region. Not just because of like some natural resource or whatever not gets touted today with our other interventions, but because there was a very real fear that if you give the communists a foothold, then that is a new foothold from which they can spread to other areas. It's new infrastructure that they have in their possession, which is definitely probably, I think, the more reasonable counter to a isolationist or a non-interventionist foreign policy is that you have on your in the international arena, you have an ideology that is never content, that is always pushing for more, that is always pushing for infinite destruction. That's definitely the larger counter here. That's going to be completely thrown out the window, as we can see here in this speech. Because, no, Vietnam is not about any of that. It's about the American government just wants to perpetrate violence, and it's doing this for no good reason. It's supporting violence over there, and it's committing violence. That's what this is about, is violence, none of the greater reasons. I definitely think you're spot on there.
Yes.
So, with that, we'll go on to the next paragraph with some Langston Hughes. King says, for those who ask the question, aren't you a civil rights leader, and thereby mean to exclude me from the movement of peace, I have this further answer. In 1957, when the group of us formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we chose our motto, to save the soul of America. We were convinced that we could not limit our vision to certain rights for black people, but instead affirmed the conviction that America would never be free or saved from itself until the descendants of its slaves were loosed completely from the shackles they still wear. In a way, we were agreeing with Langston Hughes, that black bard of Harlem, who had written earlier, "Oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." So, this is this is interesting. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was full of very non-orthodox people, Mr. Hat.
Isn't it still around now? I think
yes.
I keep seeing SCLC.
So there's also the SPLC that is
right.
different.
Yeah, Southern Poverty Law Center. Yeah.
Right. But this is still around, and sometimes it makes the news. It was full of people that were what we might call theological liberals.
Right.
People that took a historicist view of, well, we know scientifically that a virgin birth is impossible, so this must be metaphorical. Therefore, the virgin birth was not actually happening. It was just a metaphor about Christ's entrance to the world, and same with the resurrection and whatnot else.
So it's that kind of Church of England thing where you just sort of rationalize yourself into not being a Christian.
I mean, the liberal parts coalesced here, much like you had liberals in the Episcopalian Church, as our definitely the more liberal wing of the
right.
Church of England over here. They do the exact same thing. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America does the exact same thing. It really doesn't matter what logo they have, what denomination they technically call themselves. They all are just the same thing. Over-rationalized, satanic diversions from the truth to where they just deny Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And this is he propagates this all the time. And in 1957, 1966, this era, he didn't exactly have the internet to go look up the statements of every leader of that conference. You just had to trust in newspapers if you wanted to. Not the greatest thing. But then we go on here, and this gets to the true nature of MLK's philosophy. He's saying that the descendants of slaves would never be loosed from their shackles unless they go along with his program. And what was his program? Well, we have the most radical civil rights and voting rights acts already passed, so he is asking for more. And it's not just Vietnam that he's referencing here. He's already said earlier in this speech, he wants more economic justice.
It's just the leftist always wants more power, more concessions, more, because I mean, they're still saying this now. How many decades later they're still saying, the legacy of slavery. We need to tear down every statue and rename every avenue, and all this kind of thing, because it's a trick. It's a good old fashioned leverage trick of rhetoric, where you say, okay, our goal is to see that the descendants of slaves are loosed completely from the shackles they still wear, but the shackles will never be gone, so they will always continue to ask for more,
Right.
Because it's a vague enough but noble sounding piece of rhetoric. That's all it is.
Right, and
it's perfect in that sense.
And whenever your key to power is finding these supposed shackles that are
Exactly.
not physical, that are not in law anymore, they're social and economic forces, you're going to keep finding them because you're going to want to keep finding them. That's
Exactly.
all that can be said here. I kind of made that point. I wrote a article on the '57 Civil Rights Act. And most people think that the Civil Rights Act just having big red letters, no segregation anymore, or something like that, when that's not at all what they did. The '57 Civil Rights Act made a commission whose sole goal it was to find civil rights infringements and then go deal with them on the local level.
There you go.
So, can you guess what happened with that commission? It only grew, and they kept finding worse and worse things. It's as if,
of course they did.
It's as if 1957 to 64 was the most racist group of years in American history.
It's because it's if you create a government body, or really any kind of powered organization that has a specific goal in mind, it will continue to find things just to perpetuate its own existence.
Right.
Obviously,
Right.
it at that point it just becomes necessary to maintain its own power.
Right,
and also
exactly.
if you then insist that there are violations everywhere and you need more money and more power and more authority, you just keep doing that ad nauseum until you become a power unto yourself, basically.
Right. So, that's what I was trying to point out there, and that's why I am currently doing actual research. Like, I have found the transcript for the Congress in 1964. I want to see what the Southern Democrats had to say about these bills, because now that I know that the bills themselves wasn't just segregation is now illegal, they had a bunch of other crap filled in them. I want to see, perhaps, maybe these Southerners had more of a point than I just hate black people. Maybe that's just a false narrative. Maybe they had something to say about the liberties in this country being taken away by a federal government that just wants to seek power for the left. So, we'll see more as that comes on. Maybe it's a false lead, I don't know, but that's the question that I'm investigating. So, Mr. King goes on. Now, it should be incandescently clear that no one who has any concern for the integrity and life of America today can ignore the present war. If America's soul becomes totally poisoned, part of the autopsy must be read. Vietnam. It can never be saved so long as it destroys the deepest hopes of men the world over. So it is that of those who, So it is that those of us who are yet determined that America will be, are led down the path of protest and dissent, working for the health of our land. And here we have King, in typical speech-giving fashion, saying that America is destroying the deepest hopes of men the world over, because they are not letting a communist regime rule Vietnam. Now, I'm not saying here it's America's job to make sure that no communism exists in the world, however much I would like no communism to exist in the world. But here we have King saying it is better for communism to exist in any country than it is for America to be involved in a war. After going through what we went through in the last article, I feel like this is a this is a political tool. And
Yes.
with that, I need to go refill my water. If you'd like to comment on that in whatever way you want.
I mean, yes, I would just reiterate what we said about the sort of very clever uses of vague rhetoric as a statement that then enables you to continue asking for it, essentially. I mean, I also think this is very, very over dramatic language at this point. when we're talking about, America. The soul of America is poisoned with Vietnam. I mean, in my opinion, the soul of America was poisoned long before Vietnam was ever a thing. But to talk about it in these terms is rather ridiculous. I think they'll probably have the intended effect upon its audience. I'm sure Turnip will be able to tell me when I get back, or maybe somebody in chat can. But there's an African American leftist figure who is like who he uses this style of talking, this style of speaking, with this constant over dramatization of rather not mundane, but rather of issues that don't warrant it. Though he's far less eloquent than Martin Luther King apparently was, based on the language here.
Sorry, who are you talking about?
I can't remember his name. I've only ever seen him appear once. He's an African American sort of Black Lives Matter ideologue figure. I think he's a preacher by day.
Is that Sharpton?
Could be. He's
I think he's a minister.
He appeared some years ago with Jordan Peterson and Stephen Fry, talking about freedom of speech or something in that whole era.
Yeah, okay, I remember that thing you're talking about.
I don't remember his name, but it just reminded me of that, the over dramatization of something like Vietnam. You're talking about a geopolitical conflict in which your country is engaged in a small Southeast Asian country, and you're talking about the poisoned soul of America. I mean,
right, yeah.
I don't know how. I mean, by 1967, you could make the argument that America's soul has been poisoned by a multitude of things. I don't think Vietnam was one of them.
and you have to keep in mind, this is the supposed minister as well saying that America's soul is being poisoned not by the ongoing drug movement, the movement to popularize drugs, premarital sex, the breakdown of marriage, the push to legalize various forms of divorce. Not been poisoned by that, nor has it been poisoned by occupying basically its homeland in Europe. For who knows how many years at this point. It's not been poisoned by the ever-increasing franchise of democracy to people who really shouldn't be in the business of governing. But it's the war that has destroyed the soul of America, not any of those other things, dear citizen. Those other things are incidental. They're liberty. The war, however, is what's really destroying this country. which is hilarious because it had gone on for 20 years before this. And there was very little objection to it, except from the right.
Yes, in fact, I meant to ask you earlier, what was Martin Luther King's position on the social decay of America? I mean, did he have any kind of Christian conservatism in that regard, or?
Well, okay, so I went over this with Aaron McIntyre on his show earlier this week.
Right.
Mr. King is very often touted as sort of a Christian pastor, so he has to be sort of conservative. But we've already mentioned no real definition of Christianity would make King a Christian. And then he was also involved in a great number of personal scandals, which they're FBI documents that have been leaked, so we can't fully verify them. And then, of course, no one around him would verify anything anymore because they refuse to speak about him. But these documents were asked to be released when Martin Luther King Jr. Day was made a federal holiday, and they were denied. They were the senators that asked to look into his personal life before they made a day out of this one man. They were denied any sort of FBI knowledge. So they didn't get to look at that. And in the modern day, the media objects to these things being released as potentially destroying his reputation. Now, what we do know about the civil rights movement, something that you don't even have to speculate on, we have the court documents, we have oaths and testimonies that were taken during the civil rights movement by people on the ground. And there were absolutely heinous acts that were being committed by the civil rights protesters. Public displays of sexual activity, public displays of urination and defecation, all this other stuff. Absolutely gross misuse of churches as basically orgy halls. Um, that's what was going on in King's movement, and he knew full well about it. It's very difficult not to. And he didn't speak about it at all, and in some cases seemed to have encouraged it, especially with his loose view of sexual morality. But that's the basic summary. And for anyone that is wondering again, where did I get any of this? I went over this with Mr. Stephen Carson on his channel about left-wing terror, where we, instead of looking at violence that week, we looked at the sort of like it's almost apt to call it a psyop, where these protesters would be bust into southern towns that hadn't, received any sort of inflow for 100 years at that point, and then suddenly you had Northerners, Westerners, Northeasterners, that were just having sex in churches, which was this is the movement that King was leading. He didn't really speak out on it, so I don't. You can make the argument, the very tenuous argument, maybe he didn't know about it and couldn't speak out about it, but I don't know how well that would hold up.
Well, I mean, the more I learn about King, the more of a puzzling figure he is, because he doesn't seem to have really been very aware of a lot. I mean, I remember some time ago watching a sort of very popular sort of liberal lefty documentary about sort of black resistance in the South or whatever, and there was a film clip I've been unable to find again, a sort of newsreel footage of Martin Luther King going to one of these southern towns, where the racial tensions were completely out of control, and it got to the point where whites and blacks were killing each other, and he went down there to preach non-violence and was basically heckled out of town by the black population there.
Right.
Because at that point they were in the midst of they were saying we very much want to continue to fight, and he looks completely bewildered and out of his depth in that clip, and it's sort of like, well, if he's meant to be leading the civil rights movement, how is it that he is this out of touch with what is actually happening in these places in America? And I mean, I know some people who insist that he was basically a clueless agent, possibly a sort of federal agent, but I was going to wait till the end to bring this up, but I was actually going to ask your opinion on his death as well, because I recently saw a lengthy video making the case that it must have been some sort of hit job. Like it could, right. the official explanation of I can't remember the name of the man who apparently shot him, can't have happened because he was supposed to have shot him from a bathroom on the right-hand side, but the bullet hit King under the jaw, and things like that. And apparently Martin Luther King Jr.'s son is the leader of this campaign that this is not what actually happened, and he's apparently visited the supposed killer in jail, and he said, no, this guy didn't do it. So, I mean, right. But essentially my point here is that MLK seems like a strange figure. The more I learn about him,
Right, and if I were to craft my own narrative, I would basically just say he's probably not as involved as most people make him today, which would automatically, sort of disqualify him from his sainthood. He wasn't doing all of this single-handedly. He had a lot of people that were pushing him in directions. I would also add to the narrative, he probably wasn't an asset of the federal government, but rather an asset of the various left-wing movements in the country. And the reason I say this is because the FBI had to keep extreme amounts of surveillance on him and his compatriots, more so than you would see for one of their assets. Because if you have an FBI asset or a CIA asset or something like that, they aren't trying to... they aren't making the same notes on you as they made about MLK. They're not trying to dig up more and more things that could absolutely destroy you. They only need like 1 or 2 or 3. They don't need a book's worth, because if you just publish the book at the public, they're going to think it's boring. If you have one thing on you that the CIA or the FBI will put out on you, or the deep state or whatnot else that says, this guy sexually abused this woman 10 years ago, that's all they need. It's flashy, it's to the point, people aren't going to get bored with that. If you put out a 10-page book, kind of supposedly like they have with MLK, the public's not going to read through that. The media is going to be schizophrenic because they're all going to be going for different angles and all that. I think that he was separate from the government, and we especially know from communications from J. Edgar Hoover and the like that he really was not liked. They absolutely hated the guy, and they viewed him as a subversive, which makes sense considering his two closest friends and speechwriters in his inner circle. One was a financier for the Communist Party, as per Wikipedia, the famous right-wing radical source Wikipedia, who will tell you that one of his speechwriters was a financier for the Communist Party, and the other one was just like, a member and an organizer. So, that's all stuff you can find. I think he was a useful force for the people that were running the government, but he was especially hated by people like the deep state, because at this point in time, there were still some elements in, say, the FBI that hated communists, like J. Edgar Hoover. Maybe that makes sense, hopefully.
Yes, it does. It's essentially, America at the end of the 1960s is just a complete mess. that's
Yes.
the more
Yes.
I read about it, that's what comes across. So.
I believe any a historian that's trying to look objective, maybe 2 centuries in the future, will look back at the years 1957 to say 1980 or so as just like the period of utter chaos that kind of showed the loss of energy in the Americans. We had been disunited before and even in open warfare, but we were able to bounce back pretty quickly in basically the span of a few years afterwards. And there was like an effort at reconciliation. All the Confederate statues that you see put up in the South were meant to sort of reconcile, because you also had Union statues put up in the North at the same time. It was kind of just to say, like, this is our heritage now, and that's all it is. There's no reason to dig up these old conflicts. And then you get to the civil rights movement, you get to the integration movement, the push for legalizing immigration. That's something else the civil rights movement did, was that, you can't discriminate who you are with in your own life now. You don't have the freedom of association. So these immigration quotas no longer make sense. We have to get rid of those and open the border. That's kind of what happened in '65 with the Hart-Celler Act. This is the framework being laid. And then you also have the civil rights violence. You have the Black Liberation Army and the Weathermen that Stephen and I have been covering on his channel, and all the predecessors thereafter. I think that after a couple centuries where there's no longer any near living memory of this, and it's all kind of past, and we'll have new issues to deal with, or they'll have new issues to deal with, I should say. This is going to be seen as the period of complete chaos, kind of before some sort of a transformation that is coming, good or bad. I have no clue. So,
Yes.
yeah. With that, I think we can continue. I don't know if we're going to get through all that I had planned for today, so we might we might revisit this as time goes on. Just because.
We have an article as well on W.E.B. Du Bois, but I think that maybe we should do him as a stream unto himself, or perhaps do a stream on Du Bois versus Garvey versus dear me versus Booker Washington. That's it.
Yeah. So, I think that would be good as well.
Yes.
So we'll just keep to this one for now, and
yes, we'll do that.
So, King goes on, as if the weight of such a commitment to the life and health of America were not enough, another burden of responsibility was placed upon me in 1954, and I cannot forget that the Nobel Peace Prize was also a commission to work harder than I had ever worked before for the brotherhood of man. This is a calling that takes me beyond national allegiances. But even if it were not present, I would yet have to live with the meaning of my commitment to the ministry of Jesus Christ. To me, the relationship of this ministry to the making of peace is so obvious that I sometimes marvel at those who ask me why I'm speaking against the war. Could it be that they do not know that the good news was meant for all men, for communist and capitalist, for their children and ours, for black and for white, for revolutionary and conservative? Have they forgotten that my ministry is in obedience to the one who loved his enemies so fully that he died for them? What then can I say to the Viet Cong, or to the Castro, or to the Mao, as a faithful minister of this one? Can I threaten them with death, or must I not share with them my life? So,
good Lord.
Yeah, so we get a lot of very interesting things coming out of here. Number one, he gets he gets a Nobel Peace Prize, uh,
Yes,
which is
mentions that.
yeah, that's a very subtle brag there that he's saying, oh, but this means that I work much
It's a
harder.
commission. The
Yeah,
commission. Yes.
yeah. So that just kind of shows you the great wonders of the Nobel Peace Prize. We give it to people that will completely bring utter unrest to a country, but so long as it's for the correct cause, it's peaceful. You mentioned earlier he went to that southern town and the blacks didn't like him because he wasn't violent enough, which that did happen multiple times, and even in the north in places like New York City. Uh, New York City, or maybe it was a town in Pennsylvania, I forget which one. Um, but his legacy was definitely rejected in New York City. He also tried to march in Chicago once, and the mayor that was there was sort of like I don't remember if he was technically a moderate, but he tried to position himself in the middle, because Chicago had quite a few groups. You have the blacks there, obviously, but you also have quite a few Eastern Europeans who did not like the civil rights movement. And then you had the old stock that was there as well that were kind of ambivalent. Um, so he had to kind of play all sides. And he worked towards compromises that brought in, like, different legislation on housing, different acts that were
Right.
being passed on integration, all this other stuff that wasn't going as far as the federal level, or as the federal level would eventually go. And King showed up to march, and he basically had no support in the city. The big city of Chicago, King had little support there because
Mm,
most people were satiated with the moderate moves that were being
yes.
taken by the mayor, and the mayor himself didn't give him favorable legal exception for his marching. He basically tried to oppose it, didn't try to give him permits and all this other stuff, which just goes to show most of this stuff only happened because it was allowed to, because the politicians that were in power saw it as a useful tool.
Well, yes. I mean, the Civil Rights Act is one of the big ones that AA mentions in the populist
Mm-hmm.
delusion, or at least in the preamble to it, where he talks about this idea that the Civil Rights Act was achieved through, sort of mass disobedience and marching and protest and all this kind of thing.
Grassroots
It
and
doesn't.
from the bottom up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It doesn't work. It was the visual it was the visual component of the opera, if we want to put it that way.
Right.
It was just part of the theater of change. Put it that way.
Right.
Also, I mean, you mentioned that mayor in Chicago. You can hardly blame him, because a lot of these so-called, noble, peaceful marches for justice and equality, a lot of them just turn into riots.
Yeah.
Things would
Yeah.
just get smashed. I mean, we all saw what happened during the summer of fentanyl. I mean, we know how bad it can get when this sort of thing kicks off.
Yeah.
So
The passion of Saint Floyd.
yes, exactly.
So and then
He
he talks
overdosed
about,
for our sins.
yeah. We have here the Brotherhood of Man. And now, forgive me if I'm being too inquisitorial here. I don't think that King is talking about, the gospel being preached to everyone. For some reason, I have a feeling he's talking about here some notion of equality that gets passed into the secular, into the governmental or the societal level, that is supposed to make everyone equal in their attributes, in their legal designations, in their class, and in their allegiance. Um, he alludes to the Brotherhood of Man quite often. And it sounds kind of Christian, especially in the modern day, where civil rights language and Christian language have been sort
Yes.
of syncretized. But
You might say
I
desegregated.
yeah. So I think that that's more what he's alluding to here. It's a leveling concept more than anything.
Yes, and I mean it's also a very, very tiresome invocation of Christian universality. I think
Right.
in a context very much not appropriate. I don't think it's
Right. Because most Christians would tell you, whenever you read, whenever you read in the book of Galatians, there's neither slave nor free, nor Jew nor Greek, nor man nor woman. That's not saying that once you become a Christian, those things stop existing. That's just saying that Christianity can be brought to everyone. There's no mutual exclusion there. of who you can preach to and bring the gospel to. It's not as soon as you get baptized and are confirmed and all this other stuff, you suddenly stop being a man or stop being a woman. You're a Christian now. They turn this into some sort of leveling propaganda that completely corrupts the word there. It's not a call now to go and preach to everybody. It's a leveling concept. Don't worry, everyone. We are all perfectly equal now that we're Christians.
Well,
it corrupts it.
It's actually a semantic error to say things like that, because to once again paraphrase dear old NGD, he says, we are brothers, but we're not equals because there are older and younger brothers.
Right.
by
perfect.
definition. I also don't quite like. I know he doesn't explicitly say it here, but I don't like this this identification of Christ with like this sort of soft liberal world peace preacher. I mean, Christ spends an awful lot of the New Testament going around being very angry with people, and there's not just a few quite warlike invocations about the fury of the Father and such. So
yeah, I don't see many of these civil rights preachers preaching things like repent and believe the gospel. Usually it's just, oh, here's the gospel, now stop being mean towards each other.
Exactly.
And nor do I see them whipping money changers out of the temples, and in fact, usually I see them putting them in there.
Yes, there you go.
So there is that, and notice the equivocation here. He is basically just saying his ministry is the one of Jesus Christ. So you and I have disagreements as Protestant and Catholic, but I think we can both agree that his ministry is not the one of Jesus Christ. I think
we can both agree that we can agree that Martin Luther King was not was not exactly a minister of Christ in a way that you or I would consider an appropriate appellation.
Right, and I'm sure you see this in sort of like the post-Christian British society. But there are many different Jesus Christ that gets tossed around. There's the one in Scripture, and then there's the historical Jesus, who was sort of like more pacifistic, who was the brown refugee from Palestine or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Then you get the revolutionary Marxist Jesus and all this other stuff. For some reason, and this might just be because I have read MLK's writings on Christ, I don't think he's talking about scriptural Jesus or apostolic Jesus here. I have a feeling he's talking probably closer to the to the revolutionary Jesus down here.
I mean, I would go full cynical and argue that he's actually talking about Jesus Christ as a rhetorical figment. It sounds good at this point in the speech to invoke Jesus Christ by name, because yes. I have certain assumptions about the audience this speech was delivered to. Let's just put it that way.
And they're probably correct. I'll assure you there.
Yeah.
And then we have something interesting here. He's pulling the trick. You can be a communist and a Christian. You can be a revolutionary and a Christian. Now, to the average person, this might sound perfectly fine. Even if it is a sin, that doesn't preclude you from being Christian. But a full affirmation of communism does preclude one from a full affirmation of Christianity.
Can we post the picture of laughing Franco?
Yeah. Perhaps our good friend, the Prince of Artifair, could come up with that for the end of the stream. If he is still listening.
Pope Pius XII is very clear on this. You cannot be a communist and a Christian. So.
I mean, you don't even necessarily need the repudiation side. I don't know many communists that would say you could be a communist and a Christian at the same time.
I don't think they would agree.
Same with revolutionaries. Now, it really depends on what this means, because you, Pat, have made a very useful distinction of rebellion and revolutionary, which most people will oftentimes confuse. But when he's making the distinction between revolutionary and conservative, I think we know what kind of revolutionary he's talking about here.
Well, I mean, he pretty much already said it. He literally said. I mean, it's somewhat redundant, I think, to say communist and revolutionary as separate things, because he's basically already made the point to his own detraction.
Right. Yeah. So, and then he's he's basically just saying the thing that you're supposed to tell to violent communists is not repentance. It's not resisting them or fighting them or anything like that. It's not defending yourself. You have to share with them life and love. Now, I don't know if the Roman Catholics have something different here, Mr. Hat, but a lot of the older Lutherans that were just coming out of Rome would say something like, "You need the call of repentance. You need the condemnation of sin in order to appreciate the gospel fully. You can't have the gospel without knowing that you are indeed sinful."
Well, I will preface by saying I do not speak objectively from the church here. This is just my own understanding of it. But I mean, as with pretty much any Christian denomination, I would say that any human soul can be saved.
Right.
But when you have somebody like, say, Mao, who leads a tyrannical, bloodthirsty kakistocracy, which is probably one of the furthest, states imaginable from what I would call a Christian kingdom. It is absolutely correct to say, well, that person is basically a target for righteous fury.
Right.
There are some souls that, even though they could be saved, will be damned anyway because they'll just because of their sin, because of their lack of righteousness.
Right, and the evil prince definitely has many more duties than the commoner.
Look at all the evil kings that we see in the Bible. Tyrannical evil kings and leaders.
So, and this is MLK downplaying all of these people. He's not calling for repentance or believing the gospel or something like that. He's calling for them love and life and peace, which are in Christianity, but are not full Christianity. There is more to Christianity than just preaching love, life, and peace. In fact, you extend the definition of love when you add in things like repentance, penitence, these very good Christian things.
Yes. So, just while we're on this,
yes.
We have a super chat from Prince of Parma, has mentioned some scripture.
There was one earlier, and we're not forgetting it. We just usually save most of them.
But I thought we would do this now.
This one's topical enough. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I will read you Matthew 10:34. I'm gonna actually use the KJV because it's more poetical. Matthew 10:34. Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. Very famous passage from the Bible. So
right,
yes.
And some people that might have been tuning in for a while will know that I really like Soren Kierkegaard. He has a series of articles in the Fatherland where he's critiquing the Danish state church, and when he's doing that, he is going up against a guy called Bishop Meinster. Who was a very popular, I guess, preacher. I don't know if he's the archbishop or something like that, but a very popular figure in the Danish state church in the 1850s. And Kierkegaard gets the objection to him but he preached peace. He was a very good Christian. He was preaching peace to the nation that needed peace in their lives. And he said, preaching peace, perhaps that can be, but it's questionable as a Christian. And then he says, but the objectioners also say he wasn't even trying to preach repentance. Why are you holding him to that standard? And that's when Kierkegaard goes on this giant multi-paragraph rant where he's saying, this is what makes him not a Christian. This is what turns Christianity into Christendom, into a culture. Preaching peace instead of repentance. These people just want comfort. They don't want actual Christianity.
Yes.
So this is something that you might see here, and this is what these liberal pastors will always turn to: is peace and love, not the full story.
I will even go as far to say that forget denominational differences. I will just say that I don't understand how anybody can read the Bible and consider that God and Christ are these like peace-loving hippies. I don't. Most of what we see Christ doing in Scripture is going around telling people how awful they are and how they
Yeah.
need to be removed. Basically, I mean that's
Be removed or changed.
most of it.
Yes.
Exactly.
So, this is a trick you'll see from many other people, especially MLK. But because MLK did it, now many other people do it. And King goes on. He says, and finally, as I try to explain for you and for myself the road that leads from Montgomery to this place, I would have offered all that was most valid if I simply said that I must be true to my conviction, that I share with all men the calling to be a son of the living God. Beyond the calling of race, or nation, or creed, in this is this vocation of sonship and brotherhood, and because I believe that the Father is deeply concerned, especially for his suffering and helpless and outcast children, I come tonight to speak for them. Now, before we get on this, I would just like to point out something that liberal theologians will do all the time, because this living God is biblical diction. But to a liberal theologian, that just means that God still exists somewhere, somehow, whatever God means. It doesn't mean that God still lives. He was resurrected, that Christ lives. This just means that it is a continuous person, like a refutation of deism or something shallow like that. And this gets on my nerves because conservatives in America will point to language like this and say, well, see, King was very obviously an Orthodox Christian. He believes in the living God. He believes in the one Jesus Christ and all this other stuff. But they don't realize that there are two definitions working at play here. There's the Orthodox that the conservatives believe, and then there's King here who's talking about the living God, not meaning the resurrected, who he wrote against. The fact that a resurrection cannot happen scientifically is what he would say. And then he just runs with this because the language fits what he wants, and he knows it'll play well with the audience. So that's what I was quickly going to add there.
Yes, I mean, again, I think this speech is losing itself in hideously ostentatious language now. I mean, whatever rhetorical fluency and semantic charm it had at the beginning, it is now just descended into a quagmire.
Yeah, I was about to say, this
again,
whole sentence here.
Yes, again, like quite shockingly self-aggrandizing.
Yeah.
The road from Montgomery. Obviously a comparison to the biblical road.
And I was just saying that, like, I think the rhetorical devices now have been either overused or they're just bad, because this is one sentence that's highlighted. You could condense this down to like a few words to say the exact same thing, get the point across, and have the eloquency as well with the diction. But for some reason, he's taken a paragraph that is consisted of two very long sentences. And I'm not a professional speechwriter, so I'm not saying I could do better necessarily. I am just saying that whenever he's held up as the greatest speechwriter of the 20th century, I don't want to be edgy, but I think that there are multiple other examples that are probably less popular that could have said something much punchier, something that could have get an audience in uproar, that wouldn't have taken this this hedge mage to get through.
Somewhere in this house, I have a copy of the Penguin collected modern speeches.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I was given it as a gift, actually, because I used to do a huge amount of public speaking, and I was always very interested in classical rhetoric. And unfortunately, it's full of stuff like this, which is extremely poor examples of rhetoric. But because it's MLK, we have to have MLK. We have to have him. We have to have Mandela. We have to have Obama. We have to have various like sort of African women for no apparent reason. And you can't really compare that with Gladstone or even Disraeli, or even the revolutionaries of the 1700s. These are not comparable in terms of skilled rhetoric. And
once again, you and I both have reservations about the group that I'm about to mention, but the NSDAP had quite a lot of very fervent speakers that were able to mobilize a nation. This did not reach nearly so far.
I had a textbook on public speaking that was that started with a preface basically explaining Dr. Goebbels is going to feature a lot in this because he basically invented a lot of mass public speaking techniques.
Yeah, and they worked really well.
Yes, it is true. That is an objective fact. I think
There's sort of like a modern narrative where the NSDAP were both horribly incompetent and terrible, but also so terribly competent that they were able to take an entire nation and just woo them and conquer half the continent and all this other stuff, and the entire continent or whatnot. You can pick one, but you can't have both.
Well, if people want to know more about my writings on this, they can see my video on Friedrich Reck.
Right.
Yes.
And and my views on the topic have matured as well. It might be good to do the Weimar stream soon. Because I feel like
proper Weimar stream.
Yeah, and I feel like building a right-wing narrative around Weimar that consists of more than just evil degeneracy or street violence would be useful.
I think the I mean, again, we're planning quite heavy things on the fly here, but I will say that I think for me, Weimar is like a sort of a tragedy in act, because you have basically the collapse of the Prussian order. You then have the degenerate republic,
right?
And unfortunately, what it ends up with is basically what I would call degenerate militarism, I suppose, like
court intrigue, perhaps.
Yeah, like it ends. I mean, I suppose there's that old principle of Marx, which is actually, I think, very true, that things happen the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. And it doesn't make me very popular, but I have very cynical views on the National Socialist regime and how it achieved its power.
Right.
Yeah,
and I feel like if we because there is the other side as well. There's a great faction on the right that just wants to hop onto any right-wing looking excuse they can in order to not support them. Kind of to get brownie points with like the world or whatnot else.
Yeah, exactly.
You, Panama Hat, have an intellectual objection, which is very much different, not because you want to be accepted by everyone else or whatnot. But I feel like if we present the status of the Weimar Republic, it might make more sense why they had such landslide elections when you look at the alternatives. And more than just the degeneracy, but also, what were the other guys saying as well. Because the degeneracy that was happening up was past. You also had every other party putting forth a promise or a manifesto. And they were all pretty abysmal, except for, one or two.
Yes. I also think that it was almost a kind of act of fate that you have Franz von Papen as chancellor, who basically there's this wonderful line in Friedrich Reck's diary that sums up von Papen, I think, and it's that he had a kind of basic stupidity at the same level of a man who equates intelligence with cheating at horse trading. It's like, and just that how you could have almost. I think the hope for a reactionary or a right winger towards the end of Weimar is that you could guide it to a kind of established right wing outlook, if that makes sense. You have Hindenburg, you have the conservative blocs, you have the Catholic Centre Party, you have all the various sort of aristocratic regionalist parties that you can use this to build something coherently right wing in the ashes of the post First World War world, but instead it just falls into National Socialism.
Well, yeah, and specifically because the people in charge probably didn't just have the will to do it. There are so many examples in the Republic where they just give concessions for seemingly no reason.
Yes, I mean, I think they didn't use I mean, it's a bit awkward to sort of say these things in hindsight, but I think the threat of international communism was not motivating enough to a lot of these right-wing groups. There was a lot of small-mindedness, a lot of petty squabbling, a lot of just general incompetence. But anyway, we'll cover this
Yeah.
properly when we're prepared for it. Yeah.
Right. So, with that, I think we can move past this paragraph and he's doing the same thing as well. So this is interesting. Unlike some of the modern conservatives of the right wing, or even parts of the center left, he's not saying that race doesn't exist. He says it exists, and he needs to go beyond it. Which is that kind of just shows you how far to the left the modern right has gone.
Yes.
And I'm not a biologist. I'm not going to comment on how extensive the effects of race are. I don't even know that I could quantify it. But there's only a certain kind of person that will be met with a controversy like race, and their only response is to say it doesn't exist.
Yes.
So that's just something to note there. We go on with King.
You might not see race, but race sees you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So King goes on. He says, "This I believe to be the privilege and the burden of all of us who deem ourselves bound by allegiances and loyalties, which are broader and deeper than nationalism, and which go beyond our nation's self-defined goals and positions. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for the victims of our nation, and for those it calls enemy. For no document from human hands can make these humans any less our brothers." So, this is interesting. I had a group of people on from a podcast called Stone Choir last week, and they are a part of a movement what might be called Christian nationalism, and this is something that another thing the right needs to get down is narratives, because there is more than one definition to nationalism. You get the very, very destructive liberal nationalism that comes out of sort of like the French revolutions and the revolutions of 1848 destroy the old Christian and conservative regimes. And then you find examples of appeals to nation. Much earlier on, like in the 9th and the 10th century, you have the Irish writing to the Pope and all this other stuff as the blood of the Irish or something like that. I don't think whenever you talk about anti-nationalism, you're talking about necessarily the old appeals to heritage or something like that, like as a broader family, but the more liberal ideology that comes out.
My objection to nationalism is the old was essentially because it was a radical ideology of the 1800s. That's what I'm objecting. I'm not objecting to heritage or blood or nationhood in the old sense, or having a people, our people, my people, your people, etc. That obviously not. But yes, that has got me in hot water before.
Right.
Just because the semantics are often so hard to grasp more than anything else.
Now, for some reason, I feel like when King is talking about, he's not talking about my definition, your definition, or anyone else's on the right. I feel like he's saying here, nationalism can be replaced for loyalties to like anything local, anything that's not international. Because he is basically, this is an appeal to look to the world, to everyone else outside of your country, not necessarily in a. I don't think he's saying look beyond your family or your locality or your group of people with similar heritage. He is basically pulling the lefty trick where he's saying you can't be nationalist because you have other loyalties and obligations to people you've never met and have no relation to. But we can't directly say that, so we're going to view nationalism, your heritage, your locality, whatnot else, as little. There's something bigger out there, and it's internationalism. Anything there?
Well, I mean, again, it's quite sort of shocking how quickly the speech falls apart, because you go from, I don't know much about Vietnam, I'm just here to preach a message of peace, to, we speak for the enemies of our nation, even though I don't actually know who they are, apparently. And, I mean, I know we haven't quite got to it yet, but you see that paragraph that's just coming up. It goes some way to illustrate the incoherence of the speech, because whoever wrote it clearly knows a lot more about the situation than they're letting on.
Right, yeah. And this is also strange as well, because, both sides of Vietnam were nationalist movements. That's something you have to keep in mind. After the French are not involved, you have a nationalist government in the South, and you have a communist government in the north that is looking more inward, more of a nationalist sort of communism.
Yes.
Similar to Stalin, if you will. I know it didn't necessarily become exactly that. But for some reason, you can't have nationalism here at home. But when we start talking about the people across the waters, you can have nationalism if you are the more left-leaning government. Which is that's a standard play by the left to the modern day. The English aren't allowed to have their own country, but if you find a random place, in the Americas or in Europe where there might be immigrants coming through there, they're entitled to have their land there because it's just right for people to have land and be around their own people, but not if you're English, not if you're Welsh, not if you are Anglo-American.
Yes.
This is the same thing here. All in this one word here. His appeals to go beyond nationalism. It's a selective application. It's a coin flip again. On one side of the coin, nationalism is bad and terrible, and if you support it, you are an evil racist and a pig-headed isolationist. No matter what definition of nationalism you use, it doesn't matter if what you're trying to find is the truth or not. If you support anything that looks like it from our view, you are going to be defamed. But then on the other hand, if we find a nationalist movement that fits our cause, we have to support them because they are fighting for what is right. They are fighting evil oppressors that is oppressing their right to self-determination. Which, I'm sure you and I, knowing the nature of empires and people, would question whether different groups have or should be thrust into self-determination.
Certainly.
I don't know that it's good. In all cases.
there was recent discussion of the imperial conception of power, that existed prior to the invention of the nation state, where you would have a king or an emperor who would rule over a particular area of land, and that area of land would have, countless different peoples and even faiths in it, but it wasn't like you define your borders based on sort of ethnic demographics as such. That was just you were just a subject of that particular king,
And the demographics would follow sometimes.
Well, yes, it would follow. I mean, obviously, the king of France mostly rules over Franks or French. I know that because, well, I'm of the opinion that the French don't really exist till the late sort of 1800s. But you know what I mean. It's that that yes, it correlates, but you will also have Habsburgs or Bourbons who rule over these vast holdings in Europe with different religious sects, different ethnicities, different cultures, and that's how governing has been done through most of human history. The nation state's really only 5 minutes old as far as I'm concerned. So
right, and then this is something that I've noticed, at least with the broader right as well. If you say one thing in one direction, people will take it and go way farther than you actually said.
Of course.
Don't extrapolate anything we are saying here beyond what we are saying, because we tried to narrow down the truth. We aren't pushing in a direction necessarily.
No, we're not. Take it at its face value, basically.
Right. Yeah. So, we have that there. Anything else on that? I don't think so, because he's basically just repeating himself at this point. He's made the point 40 times now that there are weak, voiceless, and victims in our nation, and as well on the other side of the war. So I don't think anyone would have denied that. It's a deepity or a truthism, King goes on, and as I ponder the madness of Vietnam and search within myself for ways to understand and respond in compassion, my mind goes constantly to the people of that peninsula. I speak now not of the soldiers of each side, not of the ideologies of the Liberation Front, not of the junta of Saigon, but simply of the people who have been living under the curse of war for almost 3 continuous decades now. I think of them too, because it is clear to me that there will be no meaningful solution there until some attempt is made to know them and hear their broken cries. So, when he's playing both sides again, he knows nothing about it over there, but he definitely knows that the country has not done its research.
This is particularly infuriating to me because it's that leftist trope of using an objective think of the suffering narrative to advance their own rhetorical position on a particular war. because it's never sincere. They always go, look at all the people caught in the war. They didn't want this. They didn't ask for this. Their lives have been uprooted and destroyed by war. Yes, that is extremely, extremely tragic and happens all through human history. But they always do it specifically to make a point in their own favor. It's always look at these poor displaced people in Syria. Isn't Assad so evil? Look at the terrible effects of war in Ukraine. Damn that Mr. Putin. It's never actually a salient moral point. It's just, doing it to attack one side or the other under a guise of seeming objectivity.
Right, and you can condense it down even farther. The logic always follows. Bad thing happen, therefore leftism, therefore communism, therefore liberalism. Yeah. Which is what's being happening here. And it's kind of tragic as well, because he is right. There are many people that get caught up in war that don't want the war. Now, if you're fighting communism, I'm sure more people would probably care than, say, World War I, where it was, I don't know how much merit the causes of the war had to most people. I don't think it was probably not as existential as this is. But there are people that didn't necessarily want the war to happen, and who could potentially have been fine from their own personal level with two Vietnamese governments. We've talked about the potential dangers that letting a foothold be created would cause, but that is a solution. But instead of going on to that, King here and the other left-wing public figures are going to use the suffering of those people to support their agenda back here at home. It's self-serving and it's kind of cruel, if I would say.
Indeed.
Now this is what I really want to hit in this article. So hopefully everyone is still full of energy and ready to go, because this is where things start taking a turn to the more personal side, at least for my family, and I'm sure many other Americans' families. King goes on to say, "They must see Americans as strange liberators. The Vietnamese people proclaimed their own independence in 1954, in 1945 rather, after a combined French and Japanese occupation and before the Communist Revolution in China. They were led by Ho Chi Minh. Even though they quoted the American Declaration of Independence in their own document of freedom, we refused to recognize them. Instead, we decided to support France in its reconquest of her former colony. Our government felt then that the Vietnamese people were not ready for independence, and we again fell victim to the deadly Western arrogance that has poisoned the international atmosphere for so long. With that tragic decision, we rejected a revolutionary government seeking self-determination and a government that had been established not by China, for whom the Vietnamese have no great love, but by clearly indigenous forces that included some communists. For the peasants, this new government meant real land reform, one of the most important needs in their lives. So, Mr. Panama Hat, I'm sure land reform and other forms of reform like that ring off great alarm bells for especially a British traditionalist. This is very often the means that one will take to destroy the old ancient system.
It's a very complicated question. Very, very complicated. I would say, from my point of view, the government established by the Americans in South Vietnam was very corrupt.
Well, yes.
Largely ineffectual, and I can understand why Vietnamese peasants would have serious issue with it.
Right, that's accepted.
Yes. I mean, the thing is, he isn't wrong, really. I think there were, because there was genuinely a great mass support in some regions for the Communist Party, because they were seen as not only reformers, but also as the heroes that had previously ousted the French and other colonial regimes. No. So there was a genuine love in that respect for them. But of course, everything I say has to be couched in the fact that MLK is using it cynically. as a
Well, and
rhetoric tool.
there is the other side that I thought you would latch on to, and that the Vietnamese had a traditional society that did even persevere under the French and the Japanese. But whenever you have a left-wing government that takes over in a lot of these countries, except we discussed Kenya might be an exception, oftentimes this land reform and the reforms that they will promulgate will basically aim to destroy whatever the old society was like and cement the more new modern way of living. I definitely know that this happened in the Reconstruction era of the United States. We had land reform here, and it completely destroyed the Southern society that existed from, the 1600s all the way to the 1860s. The United Kingdom had aristocratic reforms. I don't know if it was necessarily land reform, though you could correct me here. But wasn't it under the guise of reforming the class system to be more in line with the modern era that destroyed
roughly when are we talking?
Wouldn't that have been going into the 1870s, 90s, and then into the 1900s?
Well, there was franchise reform.
Right.
So basically, the ancient model of parliament was increasingly disestablished, and you instead had a kind of mass democracy.
Right.
Ironically enough, ushered in by the so-called conservatives under Disraeli, most prominently, but also under Gladstone and other previous Whig prime ministers or Liberal prime ministers earlier in the century. And that all culminates in 1918 with the Representation of the People Act, which gives the vote to all men and all women over 30, I think.
Right.
So yes.
And also, I think fair to say, Britain probably had one of the most robust aristocracies in the world before then.
Yes, because they actually still participated in government via the House of Lords and via estates and things. So it was I would argue it was a healthy system. Although I know that some argue that that it was basically all over by the Reformation, because all the lands of the monasteries and churches were broken up, and a lot of free land was taken over and awarded out to landowners. But that's an entirely separate point for another day. So
right, and the thing that I was going to point on here is that this land reform was very popular among the peasantry, and it might have even helped them. And I'm not going to make a defense of the South Vietnamese government, because I will accept it was corrupt, and I don't know as much to counter. But this land reform in these post-colonial societies is always meant to establish either a sort of like American-style government that is completely foreign to them, or it's meant to establish a communist-style government which is completely foreign to them. You see this all across Africa, especially as well.
Yes.
And this is another self-serving thing by King here, because this is direct American influence telling them, you have to give up your traditional society, whatever the merits or the costs are, in exchange for this land reform, which is itself another Western idea, or idea begotten by the West, that is being forced onto them. Now, I don't know what the status of land was in Vietnam at the time, but the pattern that I see with these things, it sets off red flags for me. Whenever you see land reform being advocated, usually it turns out that's a guise for another corrupt left-wing government to get into charge. It seemed that you were saying Kenya was more of an exception because they weren't nearly as forceful.
What, in terms of communism, or?
And in terms of redistributing land and all of that. I seem to recall we touched on that in the stream.
No, they didn't. There wasn't much land reform because they didn't want to screw the country up. So basically, they wanted to. They wanted to have a peaceful continuation of basically the old regime, but under a native government. So most of the I mean, to be fair, there wasn't much of a call for land reform in Kenya at the time, because most of the farms were relatively small. Even the ones owned by Europeans, they were sort of like small plantations and things. It wasn't like one of these situations in like the south of Italy in the 1860s where the entire peninsula is like 3 landowners.
Yeah.
It was there wasn't much need for it really. Yes, and also because the only certain regions have arable land to begin with, so it's not like there's not it's a different situation unto itself, really. But.
Right. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on here is he says, like, he very sarcastically almost says, we thought they weren't ready for independence, and he just kind of brushes that aside as like an obviously everyone's ready for independence. What hypocrisy. They never actually really address, what if a group of people just don't know how to run a country yet? Like, that takes skill. That is not just something that comes naturally that people just do. If you are going to set up a country or a group of people to govern themselves, that haven't for the longest time and who have been rushed into the modern age by colonialism, perhaps easing them into it might be a better idea than just completely withdrawing in the span of a few years.
I mean, I would make the argument that that Vietnam was ready to govern itself by the 1950s, certainly a little bit before that, even, because you had a large, educated bureaucratic class.
Okay.
You had a monarchy, which by that point had become fairly discredited in the eyes of a lot of people because it basically was a colonial puppet monarchy. But I think this is the issue with what King is saying, is that it doesn't really apply because France didn't take over Vietnam explicitly because the Vietnamese aren't ready to rule themselves yet. It was just because Vietnam is our colony and we want it back. Like, it was that simple. It didn't really. There wasn't much more rhetoric to it than that.
Right, but on the American side, this is what would usually get touted. Whenever for the people that actually supported the European empires against the sort of American decolonization part, oftentimes something that would be said is they aren't ready for total independence. Their country would be ruined by it, and to some degree that's the case. Like with the Raj, I don't know that the era immediately following decolonization was the best time to live.
No.
Not
if you happen to live on the border between India and Pakistan. It certainly wasn't.
Right, or if you happen to fall under, say, like the completely new trading policy that the supply of food is a very tenuous thing.
I would say that American involvement in Vietnam was like I completely understand not wanting to allow Vietnam to go red.
Right.
But at the same time, it does feel like kind of a lose-lose situation because you either allow communism to take root there and basically give the Soviets a potential power base,
right?
Or you get involved in a war that, let's be honest, America was never really going to win. Like,
didn't have the will to win. Like,
didn't have. Well, the thing is, I honestly think that there was just too much will to win on the side of the Vietnamese.
Right.
Like,
yeah.
Because I don't think America could ever manufacture. Yeah, I don't think America could ever manufacture the will to keep a war going in Vietnam for that long.
Yeah, it turns out America does not really care that much about Vietnam, and that might not be a bad thing.
No, exactly. I mean, it's that position of being the world hegemon empire without wanting to be.
Right. Yeah.
Really.
So. That's that paragraph there. King goes on, for 9 years following 1945, we denied the people of Vietnam the right of independence. For 9 years, we vigorously supported the French in their abortive effort to recolonize Vietnam. Before the end of the war, we were meeting 80% of the French war costs. Even before the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, they began to despair of the reckless action. But we did not. We encouraged them with our huge financial and military supplies to continue the war, even after they had lost the will. Soon, we would be paying almost the full cost of this tragic attempt at recolonization. This is hindsight, I understand, but I don't know what your opinion is on this, Mr. Hat, but I feel like most of these countries were better off under the colonies than they were after independence.
I mean,
I don't know about Vietnam in particular, but...
I mean, when it comes to Vietnam, I understand the drive of any people to rule themselves in some context, but I mean that's not really a question I can answer as to whether Vietnam was
right.
better or worse with or without the French. The French certainly had a a great effect on. I hate to use this word, but the development of the. I hate this idea that you can develop people because you really can't. But when I say development, I mean they made a modern bourgeois liberal nation state that eventually turned red. Rather like France now, which is turning brown. But the war in Vietnam, I think you could justifiably say, was America cleaning up a French mess that got out of hand.
Right, and I don't feel like it's entirely fair to say that they made Vietnam a modern liberal nation state. They were still under colonial governors and stuff like that.
What I mean is that they built all these French-style schools. They heavily Catholicized a lot of the population. They built modern roads and infrastructure and a capitalistic culture. I mean, there was quite a lot of traditionalist independence activists who weren't communists but just wanted to preserve more traditional Vietnamese ways of life. They didn't want to become a province of France,
Right, yes.
Because you have to remember that when we talk about colonies between, say, Britain and France, we're talking about very, very different things. Because the British viewed each colony as its own polity that had to be dealt with in different ways. As we went over during the Kenya stream, where the settlers in Kenya pushed for it to be made officially a colony, not a territory, because it would meant they would have more local self-control. Whereas France, because of its more kind of revolutionary nature, made every colony a province of France in the same way that the suburbs of Paris were, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah. Yeah, no, and that makes sense if you know anything about Algeria, for instance.
Yes, yeah. It's treated as just a province in the same way that, Picardy is or anything like that. It's so again, it's kind of difficult to put across in a few short words, but yes, essentially the French tried to recolonize Vietnam after the war. Then they basically got defeated in a battle by the Viet Cong, who were extremely well organized. Ironically, part of the reason the Viet Cong was so skilled in warfare and in tactics were because they had been trained by the Americans to resist the Japanese during the Second World War. Yeah. That's partly why. They were very well supplied as well.
Yeah. Our foreign policy never comes back to bite us.
Oh no, that's never happened. No, couldn't be me.
So, but the only reason I figured to bring this up is because MLK in the 1960s is an American who is saying that the French should not recolonize Vietnam under any circumstances because that's colonialism. I don't feel like he's making the same objections that you would. For some reason, I don't feel like he's saying that the French were destroying traditional Vietnamese society and whatnot else, and then this was just a reaction by the Vietnamese and the Americans caused it anyways. If I'm looking here, it sounds like he is just saying that colony is a dirty word. Yeah. Abortive effort to recolonize. Recolonize isn't just the technical word that he's using here to describe what actually happened.
No.
Because as we'll get into this, it's that's a dirty word that he's using there, especially to Americans.
Yes, and I mean, again, I will reiterate. He may have a point here about it being America getting stuck in because of a French mess they're trying to clean up.
Yeah. And I would agree.
Yes.
Now, he goes on and he elaborates upon this. Whoops. After the French were defeated, it looked as if independence and land reform would come again through the Geneva Agreement. But instead, there came the United States, determined that Ho should not unify the temporarily divided nation. And the peasants watched again as we supported one of the most vicious modern dictators, our chosen men, Premier Diem. The peasants watched and cringed as Diem ruthlessly rooted out all opposition, supported their extortionist landlords, and refused even to discuss reunification with the North. The peasants watched as all this was presided over by the United States influence, and then by increasing numbers of United States troops who came to help quell the insurgency that Diem's methods had aroused. When Diem was overthrown, they may have been happy, but the long line of military dictators seemed to offer no real change, especially in terms of their need for land and peace. And then we go back to the rallying cry of all liberal Christians: peace. Peace is the greatest good to the liberal Christian because it's the only thing you can physically have in this life. Maybe if you create it,
Yes.
you know, they don't care about afterlife stuff like repentance, hell, heaven. It's peace here and now. So, what do you have to say to this? Because having known people that had to go fight in Vietnam, I don't think that this is a really fair characterization of what was going on. You know, I think he's unifying the United States interests into one monolithic blob that simply didn't exist, and then throwing the troops in under them as well. But perhaps this
Yeah,
comes across differently to a foreigner.
It's all just rhetoric, isn't it? I mean, it's not. It's with this. I think maybe I'm wrong to keep sort of pointing it out because it's obvious. But you know, I mean, this isn't really a realistic picture of what was happening in Vietnam.
Right.
I mean, my main opinion of Premier Diem is that he was just corrupt more so than tyrannical. And I think there is some fair cause to say that the some of the landlords and landowners in South Vietnam, partly through a mixture of fear of the communists as a whole, were very brutal. In the same way that a lot of landowners were in Spain. But
Right.
I mean, that's really all I can say. Yes, the United States supported Diem because obviously they're not going to support. It's the communists or Diem. I mean, that's it. So, and of course, yes, he mentions the coup.
Here's something interesting though. He says Diem ruthlessly rooted out all opposition and supported extortionist landlords and all this other stuff. As if the communists were not also rooting out all opposition and supporting extortionist commissars.
I was waiting for the perfect moment to make this rather obvious point, but yes, I mean it's literally a communist death regime in the north. Prince of Parma mentioned one book has the casualties at 1 million for terror in the north because you know communists. But
yeah.
I mean, yes, let's point that out. You know, this is a very, very insincere leftist speech, isn't it?
This feels like Trudeau giving a eulogy about Fidel Castro. To be perfectly honest,
I don't want to rush things along. I don't have to go particularly.
Right.
But I do need to be finished up in the next sort of 10, 15 minutes or so.
Right. And I think we've basically made the point here.
Yeah.
This is halfway through the speech. You can go and read the rest, but the points are going to be very repetitive now because he keeps repeating the same points himself.
This has gone from here's some pretty rhetoric against the Vietnam War and in favor of peace to America bad, America bad, America bad, basically.
Yeah, and not even... there are some people on the right that do rightly point out things that are wrong with the United States, that I will grant. Some people, I would say, fall off the end. But this is America bad because not communist, which is a step in an even worse direction than it is now, I would say.
Yeah.
Like right now we have gay liberal democracy. I can't imagine what the coming few decades is going to be like under gay communism.
Oh boy.
So,
I mean, it's a bit of a distracted point, but a lot of communist regimes have been very, very anti-homosexual, haven't they?
I mean, well, the older ones perhaps.
Yes. Well, there's because it used to be that homosexuals were associated with fascism, right? You know, the whole meme about homofash. I mean, there's a
they
famous
aren't doing
quote.
their part for the commune.
Exactly. It's a bourgeois perversion, you know. And I know that there's a famous quote by Gorky when he said that he said, "Exterminate all homosexuals and fascism will vanish."
Yeah. So
interesting.
We'll finish off with this paragraph, and I think we'll have made the point at least here about the anti-war stuff and King and all whatnot else. He says, "So they go, primarily women and children and the aged. They watch as we poison their water, as we kill 1 million acres of their crops. They must weep as we bulldoze, as the bulldozers roar through their areas, preparing to destroy their precious trees. They wander into the hospitals with at least 20 casualties from American firepower for one Viet Cong inflicted injury. So far, we may have killed 1 million of them, mostly children. They wander into the towns and see thousands of children homeless, without clothes, running in packs on the street like animals. They see the children degraded by our soldiers as they beg for food. They see children selling their sisters to our soldiers, soliciting for their mothers.
Detroit is really a terrible place. Sorry. Couldn't resist. No.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's fantastic. But this is all of the stuff. When I said at the beginning, rumors, they were drawing on rumors, falsifications, and all this other stuff. This was used by the leftist anti-war movement quite horrendously. This is why they would spit on people as they got back after the after the draft was ended. Only to find out.
Morals. Sorry.
Yeah, only to find out a few decades later that most of this stuff was fabricated, or wrong, or misinterpreted.
Also, most American draftees spent the war on a base, getting into the occasional firefight. They weren't out there massacring children every day.
Yeah, and you know what he's doing here with his rhetoric. Yes, I'm sure many children did die in the war. This is why I do not like war. And most other people usually do not like war. There's a certain kind of person that actually likes war, and they are far and few in between.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
Now, King here, he is making out the American soldier as a baby killer, as a water poisoner, as a famine creator, as just a wanton killer who's out to kill, 20 civilians for every one Viet Cong. This is the kind of stuff that I'm sure I'm not the only one that knows people that did fight in Vietnam in the United States or even in the other parts of the world. I know there are Australians that did so as well.
Yep.
Brits had a token force that was there. New Zealanders, whatnot else. This is the kind of rhetoric that made coming back a living hell. Because you're the draftee. You were at home in your small town in America, wherever you were. You were told one day that you have to go fight in Vietnam, so you report because your parents and grandparents fought in wars. You have to as well. It's not, there's a duty involved there. It's not great, but you have to go do it.
Or you just got drafted.
Or yeah.
Drafted, yeah.
So split families apart and whatnot else. You go over there and do what you're told to do, or don't. You try to resist it as much as possible. It doesn't really matter what you do over there, because you come home and you get these people stoked up by the likes of King, who just hate them. The military will get called fascistic for the next few decades in American society, and everyone involved in it will be absolutely despised, except by parts of the right.
And it's this disingenuous usage of the terrors of war, which are a very real thing. And I will say, just briefly, I think one of the shames about the dissident right and sort of internet politics as a whole is that a lot of people get carried away by power fantasies.
Yeah.
It's
definitely.
like whenever I talk to people about Spain, there's always quite a bit of very tempting fantasizing about the kind of crusade against the leftists. But it's like, okay, well, you also have to remember that you might just be some random farmer whose wife gets raped, your farm gets burned, and you get killed by either side of that conflict, because that's just how war is. Soldiers will pass through towns and bad stuff will happen. That's how it is. You could get hit by shell fire. That's what war is, and it's genuinely terrible thing when it does happen, even if it's a completely righteous cause, as I believe the nationalist effort was, for example. But when you get a speech like this by someone like MLK, who, as you say, is stirring emotion and stirring popular consciousness against soldiers who were basically doing what their government bid them to do without really any say in it, because that's how soldiers work.
Yeah, forced, coerced.
Being coerced, being spit on, being treated as scum, being treated as moral outcasts. I mean, the whole trope of the homeless Vietnam veteran, living under a bridge, it exists for a reason, doesn't it? Because some of these people were literally cast out.
Right.
They couldn't go back.
So, I just figured I wanted to touch on this because it's hidden in flowery rhetoric. But this is absolutely disgraceful writing here. He's not directly calling them baby killers. He's just saying, "Oh, the American involvement in troops over there has caused all of this stuff." I didn't say you are the baby killer. I said that,
Yeah, exactly.
the thing you were forced into is totally different. I'm sure the public will receive it as that. So, we'll stop there. As we said, we have an article that was written by Dr. King, who in the modern day is republished by the Communist Party USA, that we will be going through on Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. And then, February, I'm sure it will be shoved down my throat. It is Black History Month, so it might be topical to go through the other one on economic justice.
Is it just me, or does that seem to be like every couple of weeks? It's Black History Month.
I mean, I remember asking why the blacks got a whole month of history for themselves in high school, and the answer I got was it was because the rest is white history. And it's really funny because now I look at the news and everything is here's this new black historical figure that we're talking about. I wouldn't care if they hadn't made this an issue.
Well, but it's like I can't stand terms like Black history, white history because it's nonsense. Like, I mean,
Right, well,
I have issue with the very concepts of black and white to describe those particular grand sort of ethnic groups. It's such a brazen, unintelligent, daft leftist talking point, just leftist propaganda.
I mean, certainly white history only encompasses the vast majority of written history in the world. So I guess if you're talking about that, it's useful, but then it starts to disintegrate whenever you go into, literally anything more specific.
But it's like you rewind 200 years, and like most of what is now Europe wouldn't even be considered white by by a lot of Anglos or Germans or whatever. I mean, it just I hate that kind of semantic leftism, basically.
So
race wars and such.
Yeah, we have a potential series on the development here, not because I just really love MLK and his speeches, but because I'm tired of seeing them touted as the greatest thing to happen in rhetoric and in American societal development, even by some people on the mainstream right. So I figured you might as well just go through the whole thing, and just tell people exactly what is this without having the flashy, ostentatious speech giving. We'll go through and dissect exactly what's being said.
And also because I mean he's sold, especially here in the UK, as this great noble saint of the post-war regime, basically. Along with Mandela, or along with Obama, or along with I don't know, Kofi Annan and Gandhi and all these types of people.
Right. Yeah, so, typical, the safe leftists that weren't extremely revolutionary, but nevertheless had a bunch of extreme overratedness and then also subversion in their own countries. Mandela, as any objective historian in a couple of centuries will look back on him as perhaps one of the more destructive forces for a country. The ANC has done quite the number.
Oh God, yes. I mean, you can look into that. I mean, I have.
We will. Yeah, we will in the future.
We will, and you and I both have very strong opinions on South African history.
Yeah.
Which we will deal with.
Yeah. With all that being said, we will now hit super chats and wrap up very quickly. So, earlier on, we have Bolero 393 for $10 says, "We shall overcome the Boomer Truth regime. Keep up the good work, gentlemen."
Yes, we will. One stream at a time.
Yes. Thank you, sir. And then we also have 14 Zuid-African Rand.
Wow.
That is, I have no clue what that translates into. The joke has been 75 cents. I don't know if that was jokes or if that was real, though.
Is that actually what ZAR stands for? Zuid-African Rand?
I assume so. I don't know what else would it stand for.
Well, because it's odd to me, because I would have presumed that the ANC would have scrubbed off any trace of Afrikaans.
I mean, I don't know. That's just kind of what you know how if you read acronyms that you don't go to look up everyone's definition, you kind of autofill them.
That sounds like what it stands for to me.
Yeah.
But
we'll see. Because I don't know everything. But South African Rand, Zuid-Africa. I mean,
I'm pretty sure it is. I mean, I'm sure Prince of Parma could tell us.
Yeah. So, and this is what we read off earlier in relation to MLK's take on Jesus.
Sorry, just to yes, you were correct.
Cool.
Zuid Afrikaanse Rand.
Okay. Alrighty.
Yeah. There you go. Anyway,
I'll have to add the last syllable.
Yes.
So he came not to bring peace, but a sword, is what Matthew 10:34 is.
Indeed.
We get another 35 South African Rand from the very faithful donator, Prince of Parma. Turnip, I don't want to be edgy. The opposite of Hava Nagila begins playing.
What is the opposite of Hava Nagila?
Well, okay, so there's two things you can do in music. You can either invert the chords or invert the notes. So it's hard to explain that, but the best thing that I can put, and this
play
is
the
not
record
accurate.
backwards.
Well, so you can play it backwards from beginning to end, or from end to beginning, or you can invert the notes. There is a way to invert notes so that you have like the opposite notes being played. So that could be something that might be funny to have for streams. Perhaps we could pass it along to our good friend Mr. D. Here we have Prince of Parma once again for 35 South African Rand. They were immensely corrupt, but it pales in comparison to the number who were killed in the north. The Brit book I read said 1+ million before 1950.
Before 1950? I didn't even see that part. Wow.
Terrifying.
Before 1950? Good God.
So.
I mean, do we need to go into why communism bad?
Yeah. So hopefully that matter is settled. For also why I was skeptical of King's tacit support.
Let's remember that. Remember, he's speaking in 1967 for anyone who missed the beginning.
Yeah.
1967.
Or was it 66?
No, I think it was 67.
Okay, all right, around there. 60s after 1950. After the 1950s.
Yeah.
So, Prince of Parma, 35 South African Rand. Thank you again very much, sir. The OSS operative specifically helped the commies because they were college graduates who liked commies as opposed to other alternative anti-Japanese. Classic American foreign policy move. And then one more, 14 South African Rand from Prince of Parma, and I would like to remind the audience, the income that I receive from this is how I can justify doing this. I don't want to become a grifter where I'm only doing this for money, which is why I will pick topics that I know will not generate as much revenue, just because I also do want to just do this, especially with Mr. Hat. So, if I was grifting, I would be trying to find bigger and bigger guests to bring on about punchier and punchier topics. Probably not dryly going through rhetoric from a speech from almost 6 decades ago.
I also want to note that I always have the chat tab open during the stream, and if anything interesting is said that is relevant, I will bring it up, regardless of whether it's paid or not, if it's just a normal chat message.
Yeah, and if we weren't running out of time right now, we might do like we did on the Spain and America stream, where we went through the chat. Because Pat and I do keep track of the chat that's going on,
we
usually it's very entertaining or informative.
We love discourse and memes.
And hopefully we'll have a server coming up soon for what we're doing. Now, Prince of Parma, 14 South African Rand. They can't use ZA as that is Zambia. The misfortune of having names that are very, very similar. And right at the end, thank you again very much, sir. Prince of Parma, 70 South African Rand. If you were going for revenue, you could do a more detailed life of Robert E. Lee. Now that would get people running and get the engines going. Thank you to Prince of Parma and Bolero for single-handedly justifying the stream.
I would love to do a stream on Robert E. Lee and various other Civil War leaders.
Now I can play very funny, and I can have the Omni disagreed panel of you, me, Paul Fahrenheit, and Christopher Sandbach, where Christopher Sandbach and Paul, it's like 2 notes being played right next to each other on piano. They're very dissonant because they're really close, but not quite, and they will disagree on it.
So what's the disagreement they would have over General Lee?
Well, extrapolations. I bet they would and also where to exaggerate what, typical historian stuff.
Okay.
And then,
well, because my only concern would be that I would just be totally out autismed by them, so I'd have nothing to say.
I mean, I might be totally out autism by then because I'm not the Southern historian expert. I just do broad American. I'm much more shallow than both of them because, as much as I love to do this, as much as I love to do history as a hobby, my degrees are in economics and entrepreneurship, so my focus is divided. I can't specialize as much as those two have. They are very knowledgeable. That being said, the panel would be funny because we would all disagree in 4 ways, just because we aren't perfectly unified. It would be hilarious.
No.
Yeah, so... That's what that would look like. So that being said, Mr. Hat, would you like to shill anything again for people that might not have been present at the beginning?
Just check out my channel. I've got a video coming up about Chesterton and Belloc and anti-Semitism coming up next week. I've got various things, various pokers in the fire. My life was completely turned upside down this past couple of months. So, but that it is looking increasingly like I will have a lot more free time than I did in December. So a lot more things will be appearing. I think my Twitter is linked down below as well. I think it is, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah, it's in Find My Friends.
And my channel. So there you go. That's all I really have to show.
Alrighty, fantastic. And something else that I didn't mention at the beginning, as well as all the links that I have are in the description. I might be presenting a paper at the Mises Institute in March. I have submitted an abstract, and they will put it through an academic process of is this relevant, do we want him here, and all this other stuff, which is good. It's not a guarantee. That's perfectly fine because they are academically rigorous, unlike most other institutions now.
Very good to hear.
So that might be on the radar. It might not be, and if they don't accept it, I might just write it anyways and put it out there for us to enjoy. So that is something to look forward to. The genesis of the topic is James Burnham's managerial revolution. I'm going to take that through an Austrian lens and see what I can tease out of it. So something to look out for there. Yeah, and with that being said, Mr. Hat, it is fantastic to have you back, and hopefully we will be together more regularly here on Saturday morning.
Indeed, we will. All my Saturdays are clear, so.
Fantastic. Alrighty. So you heard that, everyone. Look forward for the future. We have a lot in store, and I've also had a few people reach out for guest appearances. That'll also be fun as time goes on. So. We're pulling in people, not because they have big audiences. In fact, most of them I don't think do, but because they are very interesting in what they have and very knowledgeable. So that's what to look forward to. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. For here it is still morning, so have a good 44 minutes left of your morning, everyone, and God bless you all.
Indeed. God bless, and see you next time.